necessary for life: food, shelter, water, and medicine. Preventing genocide means refusing to normalize these atrocities. It means refusing to dehumanize the Palestinians, to refuse to see them as calories counted or numbers of trucks moved. We see now that this way of thinking has brought about a human dignity crisis, with an entire people on the edge of survival. On March 18th, the ceasefire was violated by Israel. That day, I witnessed the most extreme mass casualty event of my career at Nasser Medical Complex. 221 trauma patients arrived in one morning. 90 were dead on arrival. Nearly half were severely injured children. No health system on earth could cope with this, least of all one that is besieged and starved of supplies. Hospitals are meant to be sanctuaries. Healthcare workers and first responders are supposed to be protected. Children are supposed to be protected. In Gaza, these protections are simply gone. Every day, the distinction between combatant and civilian is erased. Most of my patients were pre-teen children, their bodies shattered by explosives and torn by flying metal. Many died. Those who lived often awoke to find their entire families gone. Last year, I published in the New York Times a survey of 65 American healthcare workers who had served in Gaza. 83% of them reported seeing children shot in the head or the chest. I personally treated 13 such cases in my 2 weeks at European Hospital. According to the War Child Alliance, nearly half of Gaza's children are suicidal. They ask, why didn't I die with my sister, my mother, my father? Not out of extremism, but out of unbearable grief. I wonder if any member of this council has ever met a 5-year-old child who no longer wants to live. Let alone imagined a society in which so many young children feel this way. And what astonishes me is not that some children in Gaza have lost the will to live, but that any still cling to hope. My Palestinian friends, mostly healthcare workers, no longer speak of resilience or even survival. Parents memorize their children's clothing in case they must identify their remains later. They pray for one piece of bread to give them before they sleep so that their children might die less hungry if they are killed at night. And meanwhile, my Israeli and American friends express horror at what is being done in their names. Many of us cannot understand how our governments continue to arm this senseless destruction, but you in this chamber have the power to stop it. Mr. President, I am here because I have witnessed what is happening in Gaza with my own eyes, especially to children, and I cannot pretend not to have seen it. You too cannot claim ignorance. I urge the Council, and especially my own government, to act with urgency on these enforceable measures. 1. Demand an immediate and permanent ceasefire, including a halt to all arms transfers to all parties to the conflict, alongside targeted and lawful sanctions on Israel. 2. Demand the reopening of all of Gaza's crossings and guarantee unrestricted medical evacuations, including to hospitals in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where Palestinian patients can be treated by Palestinian doctors, with safe return to Gaza assured. 3. Guarantee sustained humanitarian access throughout Gaza, allowing all essential supplies, shelter, food, water, fuel, and medical supplies, to reach all people in need. 4. Strongly and explicitly reject the weaponization and politicization of aid embodied by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, whose executive director, a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, publicly resigned on Sunday, citing the Foundation's lack of adherence to humanitarian principles. We must affirm support for existing UN mechanisms, back UNRWA, and ensure NGOs with expertise in reaching and providing specialized care to those in need have unimpeded, full access. 5. The immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. 6. The immediate and unconditional release of all healthcare workers, including Dr. Hussam Abu Sufia, now held in Israeli detention for more than 150 days. And 7. Without delay, uphold the UN Charter and act now to prevent genocide. One day, Gaza survivors may have a record of the empty promises made by the members of this council as their wounds deepened and their lives were lost. If this Council remains silent and fails to act now, that record will stand as a testament to a global failure to provide urgent care and to the collapse of our collective conscience. I'm pleading with you to do what you were entrusted to do, to protect international peace and security, and to prevent irreversible harm. The steps I mentioned are the very least that is needed. I'm asking my own government's representative to hear the voices of the majority of Americans who are calling for the same. If this continues, there will be no Palestinian doctors left, no one to care for the sick and wounded. There will be no Palestinians left to rebuild the healthcare system. We are losing a generation before our eyes, condemning people to die of hunger, disease, and despair, deaths that could be easily prevented. Thank you.
I thank Dr. Shitwa for his briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Coordinator COG and Dr. Sidwa, for your briefings. First, let me express condolences on the tragic murders of Israeli embassy officials Yaron Lachinsky and Sarah Milgram, an American citizen, at a Jewish community event last week in Washington. Yaron and Sarah were murdered for no other reason than the assailant wanted to kill Jews. It is horrific and shameful. We can and must do better to combat the sickening rise of anti-Semitism around the world. May their memories be a blessing. I think it's worth noting Yaron's final post before his murder on the social media platform X addressed anti-Semitism at the UN. Specifically, it condemned Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Tom Fletcher for spreading anti-Semitic lies. When he addressed this council on May 13th, Under-Secretary General Fletcher used language invoking the charge of genocide against Israel. Last week, he claimed that 14,000 babies were about to die within 48 hours, an abject falsehood. These kinds of remarks are absolutely unacceptable for an official in his position. Last week, Yaron and Sarah were murdered simply for attending an event for young Jews. The irony? The event discussed finding ways to bring aid to Gaza. But that didn't matter. They were targeted because of who they were. The United States has been working tirelessly to free the hostages and bring this war to an end, one that Hamas brutally started. Yet in the most delicate of moments, some member states remain unwilling to condemn the terror group responsible. Forget that these actions endanger hostages. The actual outcome is condemning civilians in Gaza to remain under Hamas's control for another generation. For our part, the United States will continue its effort to bring about a diplomatic agreement that will free the hostages. Hamas continues to reject proposals from the United States, Qatar, and Egypt that would release the 58 remaining hostages who have now been cruelly held for 600 days and bring calm to Gaza. Every day, Hamas demonstrates its lack of regard for the Palestinians it claims to represent, all while it violently suppresses protests against its barbaric rule and diverts aid meant for civilians. The United States fully stands behind Israel and its right to defend itself. In order to move forward, Hamas must be defeated. As Secretary Rubio has said, if an ember survives, it will spark again into a fire. There can be no peaceful and prosperous Gaza as long as Hamas governs it by force. The Council should apply pressure on Hamas to disarm, leave, and free Palestinians in Gaza from Hamas's tyranny. Shielding Hamas from accountability only undermines Israel's security and prolongs Palestinian anguish. Hamas must release the hostages immediately. including the bodies of the 4 murdered Americans it continues to hold: Itai Hen, Gadi Huggy, Judy Weinstein Huggy, and Omer Nutra. We will not rest until every hostage has been returned from Gaza. Let us be clear. This council should be supporting the work of the negotiators. The United States supports getting assistance to civilians in Gaza in a way that does not allow Hamas to benefit. We support the new initiative to resume the flow of aid through pre-existing mechanisms in advance of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's mechanism becoming fully operational. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is an independent entity established to provide a secure mechanism for the delivery of aid directly to those in need. We call on the UN to work with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and Israel to reach agreements on how to operationalize this system in a way that works for all. One that provides the opportunity to deliver aid directly to civilians without diversion by Hamas and other terrorist and criminal groups. The United States will support a future for the people of Gaza that is free of Hamas and full of opportunity. As President Trump emphasized during his recent visit, before our eyes, a new generation of leaders is transcending the ancient conflicts and tired divisions of the past and forging a future where the Middle East is defined by commerce, not chaos, where it exports technology, not terrorism, and where people of different nations, religions, and creeds are building cities together. The United States will do its part to help forge this new reality alongside Israel and our Arab partners. But at the same time, the United States stands with Israel in unequivocally rejecting any effort to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state or impose conditions on Israel which would be an unconscionable reward for the heinous Hamas attack on Israel that massacred and brutally kidnapped Israelis and Americans. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Sigrid Skag and Dr. Feroz Sidwan for their statements. I want to seize this opportunity to express our support to Mr. Tom Fletcher for his briefing of last week on the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Mr. President, on the morning of Friday, May 23rd, Dr. Ala al-Najjar left her home for her shift at the Nasser Hospital. She didn't know it will be the last time she said goodbye to 9 of her 10 children. This pediatrician, who had spent her life saving children's lives, became a grieving mother, forced to identify the calcinated remains, the calcinated bodies of her own sons and daughters. The body delivered to the emergency room by her colleagues in the very corridors where she once gave hope to others. Dr. Najjar's children had names. Yahya, Raqan, Raslan, Jubran, Eve, Rifan, Sidin, Luqman, and Sidra. All were killed. The eldest was 12-year-old. The youngest, just 6 months. These are these children. They were not members of a Center for Command and Control of Hamas. As Dr. Najjar buries her children, this is Dr. Najjar. As Dr. Najjar buries her children, her husband, Hamdi, is still lying in deep coma. And her 10-year son, Adam, critically wounded, is lying in the hospital. We hope he will be surviving. If Hamdi finally awakes, what will she tell him? And when Adam asks about his brothers and sisters, what story can she tell him? President, in another horrifying scene, young Warda Sheikh Khalil, a 6-year-old girl, tried to flee the flames. Tried to flee the flames. The flames engulfing her school, her shelter, after an Israeli airstrike. This shelter, meant to protect displaced civilians, became a crematory oven. Her mother and siblings were killed. Her father now clings to life. No one in Gaza is spared. Not doctors, not women, not children, and not the displaced. Not even hope itself. Mr. President, figures lost meaning. What is worth of saying 18,000 children dead? these are not only numbers. These are lives. These are dreams. These are voices, playtimes, lullabies. They were extinguished. They were the warmth of homes, the joy of classrooms. They were the pulse of neighborhood. The Israeli army killed them. They killed them deliberately in a mother's arms, in classrooms, in hospitals, in bread lines under staircases, and in tents. Their deaths were not collateral. They were the consequences of a system that sees Palestinian lives as not human, as disposable. There is no fading echo. It is a scream, and these horrors must end. The remaining survivors must be allowed to live. The world must see these children, the Palestinian children, the children of Gaza, as its own children. For Warda, for Ala, for the thousands, for the 18,000 who never got a chance to say goodbye, we must act. Mr. President, words of condemnation are no longer enough. We must act now. Since October the 7th, Israel, the occupying power, has killed more than 54,000 people. Yes, it's no more 53,000 people. Today, it's 54,000 people. Israel wounded more than 123,000 people. And since March 18 alone, more than 3,900 have been killed and over 11,000 wounded. How many more must die before action is taken by the Security Council? How many orphans must roam the ruins of Gaza? How much more blood must be spilled before this Council acknowledges that enough is enough? My country, Algeria, bears its responsibility and is determined to push the Council to act. The time for indecision is over. Mr. President, the Palestinian people were promised a sovereign state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital by the General Assembly, by this very Security Council, and by the international community. Yet, 3 decades after Oslo, the dream of a Palestinian state is vanishing under the boots of the Israeli occupation and the silence of the international community. The Israeli occupation persists, emboldened by impunity, by immunity. Settler violence surges. Settlement spreads. Palestinian land is swallowed inch by inch, and holy sites are desecrated while the world looks on. The global system means to uphold justice has become paralyzed. So we ask, what is expected of the Palestinians? Must they continue offering their children on the altar of global inaction? Does the international community still believe in a two-state solution? President, Palestinians, like all human beings, like all people, have the right to life, to dignity, to homeland. They are not an exception. We must resolve this conflict as its roots. Not just a lasting peace can exist. Not just and lasting peace can exist without the realization of the Palestinian people's right to an independent state. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune stated, and I quote, "We must act decisively to end the ongoing historical injustice inflicted upon the Palestinian people. We must urgently revive the peace process, which is currently facing an unprecedented deadlock. It is imperative to compel the occupying power to comply with the relevant United Nations resolutions and to adhere to its obligation. The solution is well known. It's time for its implementation. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Algeria for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Special Coordinator Kaag and Dr. Sidwa for their important and thought-provoking briefings this morning. Mr. President, this Council has continuously discussed the immediate effect, devastating effect, of a number of concerning recent developments in the occupied Palestinian territories. In Gaza, we've discussed a disastrous humanitarian situation, more than 53,000 dead, over 100,000 injured, and the entire population on the brink of a man-made famine. As part of an overwhelming majority of voices in this Council, Denmark reiterates once again that humanitarian aid must flow freely and at scale into Gaza in line with international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles. We have opposed an expanded Israeli military offensive, and we have called for an immediate end to the war, along with the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. In the West Bank, we've called for an end to settler violence and illegal settlements, which have recently accelerated an unprecedented speed. Yet, we continue to witness forced displacement, demolitions, and movement restrictions imposed on Palestinians. Mr. President, as we condemn the immediate effects of these developments, this Council has a responsibility to address their long-term impact on international peace and security. And let me make 3 points in this regard. First, the people of Gaza are starving. Starvation, especially for children, can cause irreversible harm that could impact the rest of their lives. The IPC warns that 71,000 children under 5 years old and 17,000 pregnant and breastfeeding women are threatened by acute malnutrition. We stress the need for Israel to take immediate action to protect the human rights to life. All parties to the conflicts are bound to comply with international humanitarian law and the obligation to protect civilians, including Palestinian children, from harm. We also recall that the right to food is a fundamental human right. Second, the war in Gaza has caused major destruction of civilian infrastructure with devastating effects on children's education. More than 9% of all have sustained damage. 660,000 children are pushed out of school and have lost as much as 19 months of education. In occupied East Jerusalem, another 800 students were forced out of their classrooms earlier this month after Israeli forces forced the closure of 6 UNRWA schools. Losing access to education risks leading to long-term consequences for children's well-being and learning. Education is critical for coping with trauma of war, and we just heard this morning Dr. Sidwa assessing half of Gaza's children are the civilian infrastructure, including schools, must be protected, included by refraining from the use for military purposes. We call for Palestinian children's rights to safe education to be protected. Third, in the West Bank, Israel is taking control of record amount of Palestinian land, displacing Palestinians into isolated enclaves, making it virtually impossible to form a contiguous and viable future Palestinian state. We recall that the EU has adopted sanctions against violent extremist settlers and encouraged other Council members to do the same. Recently, we've also taken note of the Israeli government's disturbing decision to initiate land registration in Area C and register it to private Israelis. Denmark reiterates that any attempt by Israel to annex Palestinian land would be unacceptable and violate international law. Mr. President, in Israel, Hamas' heinous terrorist attacks have caused extreme and lasting trauma and has pushed Israelis and Palestinians further apart. We continue to condemn the brutal terrorist attack and the ruthless hostage-taking by Hamas, and we reiterate our demand that all hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. Taken together, these developments do nothing to serve the long-term interests of peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis. Denmark remains firmly committed to Israel's security. However, this cannot come at the cost of the civilian Palestinian people and their right to live in peace and dignity. I therefore reiterate Denmark's urgent calls to Israel to halt the ongoing and intensified military offensive and immediately allow for the full resumption of humanitarian aid. The United Nations and humanitarian organizations must be allowed to work independently and impartially to save innocent lives now. We can neither ignore the devastating immediate effects of the current developments nor their long-term impact on future generations of Palestinians and the viability of the two-state solution. Denmark maintains that the two-state solution is the only viable path to achieve permanent peace and stability in the Middle East. We look forward to the upcoming conference on the implementation of a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the Parliament representative of Denmark for her statement, and now I give the floor to the Parliament representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I want to thank Special Coordinator Kak for her briefing today and for asks. I also want to thank Dr. Sidva for his testimony and for his work in Gaza. Mr. President, many times we have said we are lost for words, but we cannot repeat these phrases over and over again. Early on during our council term, I instructed my team to avoid lengthy explanations of the situation on the ground in our statements. This is for the briefers, who usually on a weekly basis or even more often inform us about the state of affairs. And here at the UN and in the Security Council, I think we are very lucky. We are very privileged. We are honored to have the best briefers on the situation on the ground. From Special Coordinator Kak to Undersecretary General Fletcher to civil society briefers like Dr. Sidva today. Our role is not to challenge the briefers, is not to challenge the messages, but to address the message. Our role is to take positions, to be the one who takes into account briefings, the one who can carefully examine the positions of the others and find possibilities for the Council to react to threats of international peace and security. Mr. President, my statement can be summarized in one word and one sentence. The word is responsibility. And the statement is, we have responsibility to protect civilians in Gaza. Burning tents, striking school-turned shelters, continuously displaying civilians, causing hunger, shutting down hospitals, cutting essential services. These grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law have pushed thousands of civilians to the brink of survival. As the task of listing every single cruelty has become impossible, our responsibility not to remain silent has become clearer, and the responsibility to act. We have a clear responsibility to protect civilians. With the alarm bells ringing through the latest IPC report and the information circulating on the hunger in Gaza, we continue calling for immediate lifting of the blockade on Gaza. As the full blockade surpasses 2 months, we must be clear that the current volume of aid reaching Gaza is not enough, and that entry at scale and safe and unhidden distribution are urgently needed. Crossings need to be open. All possible corridors used and facilitation must be granted. Safe passage for medical personnel and humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. Time is of the essence. We repeat that any actor delivering humanitarian assistance must adhere to international humanitarian law and international principles on humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We repeat our deep concerns over the new model of distribution of aid. We welcome the UN coordinated plan to resume humanitarian aid deliveries to Gaza, and as clearly underlined in today's statement by the EU High Representative Kallas, we recall the indispensable role of the UN in distributing humanitarian assistance. During the ceasefire, the UN proved that it can deliver if allowed. Mr. President, we have a clear responsibility to act. This is why Slovenia fully supports the ongoing efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to find a negotiated solution for a ceasefire in Gaza. We call on all parties to engage in good faith. This is why Slovenia strongly supports the conference on the two-state solution to be held in June under chairmanship of France and Saudi Arabia. But we do believe these efforts should be done hand in hand with the action of the Security Council. Time is of the essence. The Council should be clear in its unambiguous demand for unimpeded humanitarian access and that is why we support urgent action of the Council. We hope the Council will show unity when voting on a humanitarian resolution that is now being discussed among the elected members. Mr. President, remaining silent is not an option. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Slovenia for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President.
la France remercie la coordonnatrice spéciale, Madame Sigrid Kaag, et Monsieur le Docteur Feroz Sidwa pour leurs exposés qui viennent nous rappeler le calvaire des populations civiles de Gaza. Monsieur le Président, la France n'oubliera jamais les atroces attaques terroristes du 7 octobre 2023, les otages encore à Gaza au du Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes doivent être libérés, et le ministre l'a rappelé, ici même, le Hamas ne fait pas et ne doit pas faire partie de la solution à Gaza. Il doit être désarmé, il doit être politiquement neutralisé. Mais la population civile de Gaza n'est pas le Hamas.
Hamas. And civilians in Gaza are enduring a humanitarian situation that is devastating. And the Security Council has an obligation to act in response by continuing to demand that Israel meet its obligations under international humanitarian law, and the Security Council must act and adopt a humanitarian resolution.
Premièrement,
Firstly, all obstacles
à l'entrée à
to the
l'acheminement de
entry and
l'humanitaire
delivery
et
of
toutes les
humanitarian
restrictions
assistance
sur
and
les
all
quantités et la
restrictions
composition
on the
de celles-ci
quantity
doivent être
and
levées.
composition of this assistance
Les
need to be
quantités extrêmement
lifted.
restreintes entrées ces derniers jours
highly
ne
limited
permettent pas
quantities
de
of
répondre aux
recent
besoins des
days
populations,
are insufficient when it comes to meeting the needs of the
11 longues semaines de
populations,
blocus total.
especially after 12
Les images de
long
personnes
weeks of total
affamées prenant
blockade,
d'assaut
the
des camions
images
et des points
of
de distribution de l'aide
desperate,
en sont
starving
une
people throwing
illustration
themselves on trucks and
Des
aid
dizaines de
distribution
tonnes
points
d'aide
are a
financées
tragic
par la
illustration of
France
this.
et d'autres
Dozens
pays
of tons of
ne peuvent être
assistance
acheminés à
financed
Gaza.
by France and
C'est
other
inacceptable.
countries not being delivered to
Deuxièmement,
Gaza
nous
is
apportons, nous
unacceptable.
réitérons
Second,
notre plein soutien
we
aux
reiterate
Nations
our
Unies
full support for
et à
the
leurs
United
partenaires
Nations
humanitaires
and humanitarian
qui ont
partners
prouvé leur
thereof,
capacité
who
à
have
acheminer
demonstrated their
l'aide dans le
ability
plein
to deliver
respect
assistance
des principes
fully
humanitaires.
in line with
Nous saluons
humanitarian
le plan annoncé
principles.
le 16
We
mai
applaud
qui
the plan
renforce
that
les
was
garde-fous
announced on
contre les
16
risques de
May,
détournement
which
de
shores
l'aide.
up
Nous
safeguards
appelons à ce
against
titre
the
Israël
risks of
à
a
permettre le
diversion.
plein
And we
accès
call in
des
this regard
personnels
upon
des
Israel
Nations
to
Unies à
facilitate
Gaza
and to
afin
allow
de
for
vérifier
full
la
access of
délivrance
UN
de l'aide
personnel to
humanitaire
Gaza in
comme
order
le
to
prévoit
verify
la
the delivery of
résolution
humanitarian
2770.
assistance as stipulated
Je le répète,
in resolution.
nous apportons notre
In
soutien à
Resolution
l'UNRWA,
2720,
au
we
secrétaire
recall our
général
support for
adjoint
UNRWA,
Fletcher
the
et à ses
Undersecretary General
services,
Fletcher
à
and
l'ensemble
services,
des
and we
agences,
support all
fonds, programmes,
UN agencies, funds, and programs,
organisations du système
as
des
well as
Nations Unies, engagées
systems
sur le
who are
terrain pour
working
témoigner
on the ground,
honnêtement,
seeking to provide
impartialement
honest,
et agir
impartial
en humanité.
testimony and to
Nous
deliver
demandons à
on
Israël de
humanitarian
permettre aux
needs. We
Nations
call upon
Unies
Israel
et à
to
leurs partenaires
allow the United
humanitaires
Nations
d'opérer
and
en toute
humanitarian partners
sécurité
to operate in full
la mise en
safety and
place d'un
security,
système
the
alternatif
establishment of an
qui ne
alternative
respecte
system
ni le droit
which respects
international,
neither
ni ses
international
principes
law nor
humanitaires et
humanitarian principles
engendrerait des
thereof, and
déplacements
which
forcés de
may
population
gender
n'est tout
and
simplement
genders
pas
forced
acceptable.
displacement of people is
La
simply
journée d'hier a montré
unacceptable.
de façon criante
Yesterday was
les
a
limites du
stark
dispositif mis en
illustration
place par
of the
Israël.
limitations of the mechanism that
La
Israel
France
has
rappelle en
established.
outre sa ferme
Moreover, France
opposition à tout
recalls
projet
its
d'occupation
firm
permanente
opposition to any
par
permanent
Israël de la
occupation
bande de
plan by
Gaza
Israel
et de
for the Gaza
déplacement
Strip
forcé de
and
la
the
population.
forced displacement
Ces
of
violations graves du droit
people.
international
These
mèneraient à
grave
une impasse
violations of
absolue.
international law
En outre,
are leading to
la
a complete
protection des populations
impasse.
et infrastructures
Moreover, the protection
civiles
of civilians
fait
and civilian
pleinement partie des
infrastructure
obligations
is
d'Israël
part and
au titre
parcel
des conventions de
of
Genève,
Israel's
les
obligations
frappes répétées
under
sur
the
des
Geneva
écoles,
Conventions.
des hôpitaux, des
Recurrent
habitations
strikes
civiles
targeting schools,
sont
hospitals,
inacceptables et doivent cesser.
homes are unacceptable
Monsieur
and
le
must
Président, il est
end.
urgent qu'Israël
Mr.
cesse ses
President, there is
opérations
an
militaires et
urgent
qu'un
need for
cessez-le-feu
Israel
permanent
cease its
soit
military
établi
operations for
à Gaza.
a permanent
La
ceasefire to be
France
established
appelle
in
les
Gaza.
parties à
We
revenir au
call
plein respect de
upon
l'accord de
the parties
cessez-le-feu
to revert
et
back to
salue les
full
efforts
respect
des
with the
États-Unis,
ceasefire. And we
du
applaud the
Qatar et
efforts
de
undertaken
l'Égypte
by
pour
the United
faciliter
States,
les
Qatar,
pourparlers.
and Egypt as they endeavor to
Je
facilitate
le réitère,
negotiations. I wish to
nous sommes
reiterate the
solidaires,
following.
sans faille,
We stand in
avec les familles de
solidarity,
tous les otages qui
solidarity
doivent
with all
être
the families
libérés
of all
sans
of the hostages who need to be
Nous réaffirmons le
released
droit
without delay. We
des Israéliens
reaffirm
à vivre
the
en
right of
sécurité
Israelis
et
to live in
condamnons
safety and
les
security. We
récentes attaques
condemn the
houtiques.
recent Houthi attacks.
Mais l'urgence, c'est de construire
However,
une
there's an urgent
alternative à la
need
guerre
to
pour les
propose an
Palestiniens et
alternative to
l'Israël.
war for Palestinians and
Une
Israelis,
alternative fondée
an
sur la solution à
alternative
deux États
rooted
et
in
la
the two-state
satisfaction des
solution,
aspirations légitimes des
one
deux
that
peuples,
reflects the
palestiniens et
legitimate
israéliens
aspirations
tout
of the
autant,
two peoples,
à avoir un État
Palestinians
et à
and
vivre
Israelis, to
en paix
have a
et en
state
sécurité.
and to live
La
in
France
peace
remercie
and
les États
security.
membres de leur
France thanks
mobilisation
member
lors de
states
la
for their
réunion
mobilization
préparatoire
during
du
the
23
preparatory
mai,
meeting on the
en
23rd of May,
particulier ceux qui ont accepté
specifically
la
those who
responsabilité
have
de groupes de
accepted
travail.
responsibility
Il faut
of the
maintenant
working
prendre des
group.
engagements
There's a
concrets,
need now to adopt
politiques, financiers et
concrete political,
matériels
financial,
pour
material
préserver la
commitments
solution à deux
to
États dans la
preserve the
perspective
two-state
de
solution
la
with a
de
view
la
to
conférence
the
qu'avec
convening
l'Arabie
of the
saoudite,
conference
la
which France will
co-présidera
co-chair with
le
Saudi
17 au
Arabia on the
25 au 20 juin
17th to the
2025,
20th of June
conférence internationale
2025.
convoquée
This is an
à la demande
international
de
conference which will be
l'Assemblée
convened at the
générale
request of the General
en soutien à la
Assembly
solution aux États
to
ici à
support
New
the
York.
two-state solution
Le
here
ministre des Affaires
in New
étrangères
York. The
l'a
foreign
rappelé,
minister
la France
recalled
souhaite que cette
that
conférence
France
permette d'avancer conjointement
wishes to see
sur
this
la paix,
conference
la
resulting
sécurité
in meaningful
d'Israël et
progress
de la
on peace, security
Palestine,
for
la
Israel and
reconnaissance de la
Palestine, the
Palestine comme
recognition
État,
of
la
Palestine as a
normalisation et
state,
l'intégration
normalization
régionale, le
and regional
désarmement du
integration,
Hamas et la
disarmament of
rénovation de la
Hamas,
gouvernance
and
palestinienne.
the restoration of Palestinian governance. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of France for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, thank you for convening today's meeting. I also thank Special Coordinator CAG for her comprehensive briefing, and I have also listened carefully to the moving testimony of Dr. Sidwa. Mr. President, about 2 weeks ago, we received a sobering briefing from USG Tom Fletcher as he appealed to us to seriously examine the legacy of this Council, or the legacy this Council would leave in relation to what is currently taking place in Gaza. Today, we have again heard a similar appeal from Special Coordinator CAG and Dr. Sidwa, even as the situation continues to worsen in unimaginable ways. No one should be made to live under the horrific circumstances that Palestinians in Gaza have been experiencing since 7th of October. This Council must take principled and urgent action in response to the grave situation that has been foisted on the Palestinian people in Gaza. Mr. President, as efforts continue for achieving a return to the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, Guyana is of the view that any peace deal reached should have at least 3 guarantees. First, Palestinians should not be forced to give up any of their rights in exchange for peace. Specifically, they should not be forced to forfeit their homeland. A choice between continuation of the Israeli offensive and forced displacement is a false choice. Second, any peace deal should comply scrupulously with international law. The war in Gaza has set, or seen attempts to set, precedents that are plain violations of international law, particularly international humanitarian law. Recall, for example, restrictions imposed on the United Nations and humanitarian workers. The Knesset legislation against UNRWA is a case in point. Recall also Israel's ongoing aid blockade and its proposed mechanism for aid delivery under the control of its military. Third, the protection and well-being of civilians should remain the chief consideration of any peace deal. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza continues to worsen in unimaginable ways, as described by Special Coordinator. We are especially concerned by the escalating strikes on tents, residential buildings, schools, and crowded hospitals, and the methodical destruction of entire neighborhoods. The constant evacuation orders and the militarization of the majority of the Gaza Strip are equally concerning. There is nothing that can justify this level of violence against civilians, among whom are children, including babies. The aid blockade, which was imposed on 2nd March, seriously crippled the humanitarian efforts that were facilitated by the ceasefire deal. While noting the recent lifting of some restrictions by Israeli officials, we simultaneously noted that certain measures are severely limiting humanitarians' ability to take advantage of this small respite. We noted, for example, the challenges created by insecurity, delays in coordination approvals, and inappropriate routes being provided by Israeli forces that are not viable for the movement of cargo. These are all man-made obstacles. We call on Israel to fulfill its international legal obligations regarding access to essential goods and services by the civilian population of Gaza. The provision of aid must be governed by the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Guyana expresses its confidence once again in the ability of the United Nations and its partners to deliver aid at the required scale throughout Gaza, if given the relevant facility by the occupying power. The UN has consistently demonstrated its readiness every time there has been an opportunity to get aid into Gaza. The state of food insecurity in Gaza is also extremely worrying, with many Palestinians experiencing what they described as a slow death sentence. The testimony of humanitarians in Gaza that, and I quote, Palestinians prefer to die by an airstrike than to go through the suffering of a lack of food and lie to their children about their next meal, end of quote, is an indictment on those who have created these types of choices for innocent civilians. Mr. President, colleagues, it has not escaped us that while negotiations, which we welcome, are ongoing to reach a nuclear deal with the objective of avoiding the potential destruction of another country, different weapons are being employed against the Palestinian people, resulting in their destruction. Regrettably, we are not responding meaningfully to counter the actions of the Israeli Defense Force. What makes this even more concerning is the fact that the visuals of the decimation of Palestinians are live streamed across the globe, yet we are not acting to stop it. The judgment of future generations will be justifiably harsh towards us. We who saw the attempts at obliterating an entire people, but did not act. This Council has the opportunity to act now. Enough is enough. Mr. President, in light of the foregoing, Guyana is compelled to reiterate the following appeals. First, we call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, in accordance with Resolution 2735. Nothing justifies the collective punishment of the Palestinian people, and it is clear that the military objectives set by Israel cannot be met without severe consequences for civilians. Second, Guyana reiterates its call for the release of all hostages being held in Gaza, as well as all Palestinians detained by Israel without charge. The taking of hostages is a war crime, and all perpetrators must be held accountable. Third, Guyana appeals to Israel to completely lift the humanitarian aid blockade on Gaza, and to allow the United Nations and its partners to carry out their life-saving work. International humanitarian law demands that Israel fulfill its obligations towards civilians, and the International Court of Justice has reaffirmed this. Finally, Guyana appeals to this Council and the international community as a whole to work urgently to revitalize the two-state solution as the only just and comprehensive solution to the Palestinian question. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Presidency for convening this timely meeting in light of the deepening humanitarian crisis in the occupied Palestinian territories. We thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag for her briefings and for her efforts as the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. We also thank Dr. Ferouz Sedwa for his briefings. We remain gravely alarmed by the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, where the continued military escalation has pushed the population to the edge of survival. There is quite simply no safe place to go, in Gaza for civilians. The recent reports of famine risk, forced displacement, and destruction of vital infrastructures are deeply distressing. This is a crisis entirely man-made and preventable, which is exacerbated by the persistent denial of access to a life-saving aid. Somalia strongly condemns the ongoing restrictions on humanitarian access and calls for an immediate, safe, unhindered delivery for the assistance throughout Gaza. All border crossings, including Rafah and Karim Shalom, must be reopened, and international humanitarian law must be respected without exceptions. We also express our concern regarding the mounting pressure on UNRWA and reiterate our full support for its critical role in serving the Palestinian refugees. Attempts to legitimize or defund the agency threatens not only the rights of the refugees, but also the broader stability of the region. We are further troubled by the continuous settlement activity and settlement violence against civilians in West Bank, and the erosion of the legal and historical status quo of the Jerusalem. The right of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination, return to their homeland and statehood, are not subject to negotiation or delay. Mr. President, the blatant disregard for binding decisions of International Court of Justice, including the provisional measures issued in January and March of this year, is a direct challenge to the international legal order. Israel as occupying power bears legal responsibility under the international humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention. These obligations are not optional, they are binding and they must be enforced. Attacks on civilians and obstruction of humanitarian aid, targeting a medical facility, and the use of starvation as a weapon of war all demand independent investigation and credible justice redress. The consequences of this prolonged conflict are not limited to Gaza. The crisis has triggered widespread regional instability, increasing tensions across the Middle East. The situation risks spiraling into a broader confrontation with a serious implication for the international peace and security. Mr. President, this Council cannot remain silent as its innocent lives are lost and humanitarian norms are violated. We call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, the full restoration of humanitarian access across Gaza. Somalia supports all credible diplomatic efforts aimed at de-escalation and the conflict resolution, including the upcoming International Peace Conference, co-hosted by Saudi Arabia and France. We urge the international community to seize this moment and relaunch a serious political process toward a just, lasting peace, one that guarantees the establishment of independent and sovereign Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif at its capital, in line with international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. To conclude, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its commitment to working alongside fellow Council members and regional partners to uphold international law, defend humanitarian principles, and advance the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Coordinator Karg and Dr. Sidwa for their briefings today, which painted a catastrophic picture. Let me pay tribute to you and to your humanitarian and health worker colleagues working tirelessly to alleviate this suffering. I'll make 3 points. First, the UK has always supported Israel's right to defend itself. It suffered a heinous attack by Hamas on 7 October, and the hostages have been through an unimaginable ordeal. We reiterate our call for their immediate and unconditional release and accountability for those responsible. But as my Prime Minister has said, We strongly oppose the Israeli government's escalating military action in Gaza, which is wholly disproportionate. An immediate ceasefire, not more bloodshed, is the way to secure the release of the hostages and stop the endless cycle of violence. Second, as we have heard again today, the level of human suffering in Gaza is intolerable. Civilians face starvation, displacement, and trauma. The UN warned of the risks from the Israeli government's plan for aid delivery. In Rafah yesterday, we saw this warning become a reality. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation lost control of its distribution center, with multiple casualties reported and great distress for those desperately seeking aid. In contrast, the UN has a clear plan to deliver life-saving aid at scale. It contains robust mitigations against aid diversion. Brave humanitarians stand ready to do their jobs. 9,000 trucks wait at the border. Our message to Prime Minister Netanyahu is clear. Let aid in and enable the UN to operate now. We reiterate our support for the UN, OCHA, and all its aid agencies. We also reject the Israeli government's unacceptable intention to take control of the Gaza Strip. Permanent forced displacement is a breach of international humanitarian law. Third, President, in the West Bank, violent settlers continue to assault and abuse Palestinians, forcing entire communities to flee. In Jerusalem, provocative visits to holy sites and inflammatory language by Israeli ministers are adding to the tensions. On 20 May, the UK announced further sanctions on individuals and entities promoting violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. We will continue to act against those committing these abuses. President, the UK will not give up on the two-state solution. We will continue to work closely with France, Saudi Arabia, and all our partners towards a successful conference in June, which moves us towards this goal. Finally, let me finish by condemning the horrific murders of Yaron Lishinsky and Sarah Milgrim in Washington, D.C. last week, and offering condolences to their families and to their colleagues. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you
señor presidente.
very much, Mr. President.
Panamá agradece la convocatoria de
Panama would
esta
like to
sesión,
thank you for convening
así
this
como a la
meeting,
señora Sigrid
and
Kaag,
we'd like to thank Madam
coordinadora
Sigrid Kaag,
especial
interim
interina para el proceso de
Special
paz en
Coordinator
Medio
for the peace
Oriente,
process in the
y
Middle
al
East,
doctor
and Dr. Sidwa
Feroze
Feroze.
por sus intervenciones,
Thank them both for their
y
briefings.
reconoce a los
And we
representantes
recognize the representatives
de Israel,
of Israel
Emiratos
and
Árabes
the United
Unidos y
Arab
del Estado Observador de
Emirates and the
Palestina,
Observer State of
que nos
Palestine,
distinguen con su participación
who
en esta
honor
reunión,
us with their
a la
participation
vez
in
que
this meeting.
agradecemos sus dramáticas explicaciones.
And we thank the briefers
Panamá
for
escucha
the
con
dramatic
profunda
details they shared
preocupación
with us.
los testimonios
Panama
y las
is very
imágenes que
concerned
cada
about
día
the testimony
evidencian
and
que Gaza
images that
y
bear witness every
Cisjordania
day to the fact that Gaza
atraviesan
and
una
the West Bank
catástrofe
are going
humanitaria
through
de
a
proporciones
humanitarian
devastadoras.
catastrophe of devastating
Reiteramos
proportions.
el llamado
We
urgente
reiterate our
a
urgent call
restablecer un alto al fuego inmediato
for a
que
restoration
permita
of an
facilitar
immediate
el acceso
ceasefire that
seguro
will
de la
facilitate
vital
safe
ayuda
access for
humanitaria
vital
y la
humanitarian
liberación
assistance
inmediata,
and the
digna
immediate,
e incondicional
dignified and
de todos
unconditional
los
release
rehenes.
of all the hostages.
Presidente, el 7 de octubre de
the 7th of
2023
October
marcó un
2023
punto de quiebre.
was a turning point.
Ese día,
On that
que debía
day,
ser como cualquier
which
otro,
should have been like
se
any other
convirtió en
day,
una pesadilla para cientos de familias
this
israelíes
became a
con
nightmare
consecuencias
for hundreds of
trascendentales.
thousands,
Los
for hundreds
ataques
of Israeli
llevados
families
a cabo
with
en los
far-reaching
kibbutz israelíes,
consequences.
en
The
sus
attacks on the
ciudades,
Israeli
en el
kibbutzes,
Festival
the
Musical
cities,
de
the
Nova,
Nova Music
en los
Festival,
cuales
where
1.200 civiles
1,200
inocentes
innocent
israelíes,
Israeli
muchos de
civilians
ellos jóvenes,
were present. Very many
fueron
of them young
vilmente
people.
asesinados
They
con
were despicably
premeditación y
murdered
crueldad
with
intencional
premeditation and
injustificable en
unjustifiable
territorio
intentional
israelí.
cruelty on Israeli territory.
Fueron asesinadas esas personas y otras
These people
251
were
secuestradas
murdered
y
and
llevadas
another
a túneles oscuros en
251
Gaza,
kidnapped and taken to dark
siendo
tunnels in
este el
Gaza.
saldo neto de la
This was the
masacre.
outcome of the massacre.
Fueron arrancados de sus
People who were
hogares y
plucked
del
from their
entorno que les
homes
daba
and the
seguridad.
environment that
El
gave
terror
them
irrumpió sin
security.
distinción,
The terror
dejando
burst
una
into their
herida
lives
que aún
without
permanece
distinction,
abierta.
leaving behind a still open
Queremos
wound.
también destacar el drama
We'd also
silencioso de la
like to
desaparición.
highlight the
Aún
silent
hay
drama
rehenes
of those
israelíes
that have
cuya suerte es incierta,
those that have
y
disappeared.
numerosos
There are
palestinos,
still Israeli
incluidos
hostages
niños,
whose fate is
que
uncertain,
permanecen bajo los
as well as very many
escombros o
Palestinians
detenidos sin
still under the
información
rubble,
clara,
where there's no
cuyo
clear
paradero sigue
information
sin
about their
esclarecerse.
whereabouts.
Para unos y otros, la incertidumbre por
For
la
some people, the
desaparición
uncertainty with
impide
regard
cerrar el
to
duelo y
disappearance
perpetúa
prevents
la
them from
angustia.
receiving
Reiteramos
closure in the
nuestro
grieving
acompañamiento y
process.
solidaridad
We
con todas las
reiterate
familias.
our support and solidarity
El
with
horror
all the
desatado por
families.
Hamas el 7 de
The
octubre
horror
no fue un
unleashed on
episodio
the 7th of
aislado,
October was
sino
not
el inicio de una
an
espiral de
isolated
violencia que aún
event.
no se
It was the
detiene
beginning
y
of a
cuyo
spiral of
sufrimiento
violence
mayor
that still hasn't
lo han
stopped,
llevado los
and
civiles.
it is civilians who have
Desde
suffered the
entonces,
most.
la
Since
población
then, the
palestina
Palestinian population
también ha
has
vivido bajo
also
una amenaza
been living under a
constante,
constant threat,
atrapada entre el fuego cruzado
trapped in the
y las
crossfire
consecuencias
and
de
the
decisiones
consequences
políticas
of
y
political and
militares
military
que
decisions
ignoran la
which
dignidad humana.
ignore human dignity.
Desde el cielo, sobre Gaza ya no baja la
The skies
esperanza,
over Gaza no
sino
longer
el
bring
estruendo
hope, but instead
incendiario de una
the
bomba.
roar of bombs.
Ese mismo cielo
This same
que nuestros
sky,
hijos,
which our
sobrinos
sons
y
and daughters,
nietos
nieces and
observan
nephews
con
look
asombro y
upon with
alegría
amazement and
cuando
joy
vuelan una cometa
when they see
o ven pasar un
a
ave,
kite flying or they
se ha
see a bird
convertido
flying
para millones
overhead.
de
For millions
personas
of
en
people,
una señal de alarma,
this sky has become
una advertencia de
an
que la
alarm,
muerte
a
acecha
warning
y
that
puede
death
llegar
lies in
en
wait
cualquier
and it can
momento.
arrive at any
Y en
time.
tierra, donde antes había escuelas
And
llenas de
on land
voces
where
infantiles que
previously there
merecen
were
futuro y
schools
hogares
where
dignos,
children had
con olor
dignified
a pan
homes, where there
recién
was
hecho,
a freshly baked
hoy
bread.
solo quedan escombros, hambre
Now
y
there's
la
only
sombra
hunger,
imponente de un
rubble,
tanque de
and
guerra.
the imposing
Los que debían
shadow
ser
of a
sus
war
años más
tank.
felices
What should have
se han
been their
convertido en un
happiest
campo
years
de
has now
ruinas,
become a wasteland
marcado por
of
sirenas,
sirens,
explosiones
explosions,
y una amenaza
and
constante,
constant threat,
generando temores que
generating
ninguna
fears
persona
that no
debería
person,
experimentar.
irrespective of their age, should
Más de
experience. More than
53.000 palestinos han
53,000
muerto
Palestinians
y
have
decenas
died,
de miles han
and hundreds
resultado
of
heridos
thousands
durante el
have been
conflicto.
wounded during the conflict.
Más de 1.9 millones de
More than
personas
1.9
han
million
sido
people have
desplazadas
been
en
displaced
Gaza,
in Gaza,
algunas de ellas
some of them
más de 10
more than
veces.
10 times.
El 81% del
81% of the
territorio ha
territory
sido
has
declarado
been
zona
declared
militarizada
a
o
militarized
sujeta
zone
a órdenes de
or subject
desplazamiento.
to displacement
En
orders.
Cisjordania, las
In the West
restricciones de
Bank,
movimiento,
the
las
restrictions
demoliciones y
on
la
movement,
violencia
demolitions,
han
and
agravado aún
violence
más una
have
situación
worsened
ya
a
insostenible.
situation that was already
Señor
unsustainable.
Presidente,
President,
la situación de los niños en
the
Gaza
situation for
es
children in
especialmente
Gaza is
alarmante.
particularly alarming.
UNICEF ha advertido
UNICEF
que
has
más de
warned us that
70.000
more than
menores de 5
70,000
años
children under 5
podrían
years of
sufrir
age
desnutrición
could
aguda,
suffer from
incluidos
acute
14.000
malnutrition,
con
including
desnutrición severa.
14,000 with severe
Muchos de estos
malnutrition.
niños
Very
ya
very
están
many of
muriendo
these
por
children
causas
are
completamente
dying
prevenibles.
due to completely
Nos
preventable
preocupa el
causes.
colapso casi
We're concerned
total
at the virtual
de
total
los
collapse of
servicios
essential
esenciales.
services.
Según la Organización
According
Mundial
to
de la
the
Salud,
World Health
solo
Organization,
19 de
only
los 36
19 of
hospitales en
36
la franja
hospitals in the
siguen
strip are
operativos
still operational.
y al menos
And at least
aproximadamente el
approximately
94% de ellos
94%
están
of
inoperantes, hospitales
are
dañados
out of
o
commission,
destruidos
damaged or
parcial o
destroyed either
totalmente.
partially or totally.
El Hospital Kamal Adwan
Kamal Adwan Hospital, a center that dealt with severe malnutrition in the north of Gaza, suspended its operations on the 20th of May. Throughout the territory, there are only 2,000 hospital beds left for more than 2 million people. According to the United Nations, the community kitchens are only able to distribute 300,000 rations per day when what is required are more than 2 million. Limited and fragmented access to basic necessities, food, medicines, drinking water, cannot continue to be the norm.
Tomamos nota con profunda
We are
preocupación
very concerned
de
to
los
take
incidentes
note of
ocurridos
the incidents
ayer
that occurred
cuando el caos
yesterday,
provocado por una población palestina
chaos
desesperadamente
caused by
hambrienta sobrepasó
despairing
las capacidades del centro de
population
distribución
who
que había
were
sido establecido.
hungry,
Estos
overcame a
hechos
distribution
dejan
center.
en evidencia
These facts
las limitaciones de
demonstrate
dicha
the
solución
limitations of
y
this
subrayan la
solution
urgente
and
necesidad
underscore the
de
urgent
una
need
mejor coordinación
for there to be better
con la
coordination
participación de las
with the
agencias de Naciones
participation
Unidas
of the United
que
Nations
garanticen un acceso
agencies that will
seguro
guarantee
y una distribución
safe
más efectiva
access
y
and more
amplia
effective
de la
and
ayuda
broad distribution
humanitaria.
of humanitarian assistance.
Todo esfuerzo humanitario
All
debe regirse
humanitarian
por los
efforts
principios de
should be
neutralidad,
led by the principles of
imparcialidad e
neutrality,
independencia
impartiality and
para
independence
garantizar que la
in
ayuda
order to
llegue a
guarantee
quienes más
that
la
aid reaches
necesitan,
those that need it
sin
the most
interferencias
without
ni
interference or
condicionamiento.
any conditions being imposed.
Panamá expresa su
Panama
reconocimiento y
expresses
homenaje
its
a los trabajadores
tribute
humanitarios de las Naciones
to and
Unidas
thanks to
y al personal
humanitarian
sanitario
workers of the
que en medio
United
del
Nations and
horror
others who,
siguen
in
prestando
the midst of
auxilio
this
con
horror,
valentía y
continue
dedicación.
to provide
Su labor
assistance with
representa una
bravery.
luz de
Their
esperanza
work
en
is a
medio del
flicker of hope
sufrimiento.
in the midst of suffering.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President,
Panamá reitera su llamado
Panama
urgente
reiterates its
a
urgent
detener la
call for
espiral
an
de
end to be put
sufrimiento
to the
de
suffering
israelíes y
the
palestinos.
spiral of suffering of
Es la
Israelis and
oportunidad de salvar
Palestinians.
vidas,
The time has come to
de
save
permitir que la
lives,
ayuda
to
humanitaria
allow
llegue sin
unimpeded
impedimentos y de
access for
lograr la
humanitarian
liberación
assistance
digna,
and to bring
inmediata
about the
e
dignified,
incondicional
immediate and
de
unconditional
quienes aún
release
permanecen en
of those who
cautiverio.
still remain in captivity.
No hablamos solo
We
de un
are
cese de
not just speaking
hostilidades,
about a cessation of
sino de un
hostilities, but
despertar
rather a
moral,
moral
de
awakening,
recuperar la noción básica de que
a
toda vida
restoration
humana
of the basic
cuenta.
notion that every human
El
life
futuro de Gaza
matters.
no puede
The future of
continuar
Gaza
secuestrado
cannot continue
por
to
el
be held
extremismo de
hostage
Hamas
to the
ni
extremism
por
of
su intención
Hamas
expresa de atemorizar al
by
pueblo
its
israelí
express intention
para
to
mantenerlo
terrorize the
rehén de
Israeli
sus
people
amenazas.
and keep them
El
hostage
futuro
to
de
their
Palestina e
threats. The
Israel
future of
no
Palestine
puede
and
seguir
Israel
siendo
cannot
rehén del
continue
miedo,
to be
del
hostage
odio
to
y de la
fear, hate
desesperanza.
and despair.
Solo la valentía
Only political
política,
courage,
la compasión,
compassion,
la voluntad
and a
auténtica
genuine
de
will for
reconciliación,
reconciliation
los esfuerzos para una reconstrucción
and efforts for
integral
comprehensive
podrán abrir paso a
reconstruction
una
will
paz
be able to
duradera
open the path
en la que
towards
israelíes y
lasting peace where
palestinos
Israelis and
puedan vivir
Palestinians
lado a
are
lado
able to
en
live side
paz,
by side
con
in
fronteras
peace
seguras,
with secure,
reconocidas y
recognized and
mutuamente
mutually
respetadas.
respected borders.
La paz no es la
Peace
ausencia
is
de
not the
guerra,
absence of war.
es la
It
presencia
is
de
the
dignidad.
presence of dignity.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Panama for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag, United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process ad interim, for a detailed and sobering briefing on the situation in the Middle East, particularly with reference to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. I also acknowledge the compelling contribution of Dr. Feroz Sidwa. Mr. President, while Sierra Leone acknowledges the fragile but incremental progress in Syria and Lebanon, the unfolding catastrophe in Gaza and the persistent violence in the West Bank remain matters of grave and urgent concern. The past months have witnessed one of the darkest moments for civilians in Gaza. The persistent obstruction of life-saving humanitarian aid, systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, and widespread loss of innocent life have breached not only the bounds of humanitarian concern, but also raised serious questions of accountability under international law. The prolonged blockade and the military operations by the Israeli Defense Forces have rendered over 80% of the territory either under evacuation orders, or de facto inaccessible. These actions have created catastrophic conditions that imperil the survival of the civilian population and heighten the risk of starvation, malnutrition, and lawlessness. The month of May alone have seen hospitals, such as the Indonesia and European facilities in Gaza, struck by attacks, further diminishing access to urgent care. The repeated targeting of healthcare infrastructure and personnel is a clear violation of international humanitarian law and must cease immediately. Civilian objects must never be used for military purposes, nor civilians used as human shields. The protection of civilian lives must remain a cardinal principle for all parties to the conflict. In the West Bank, the upsurge in settler violence, forced displacement, and destruction of property, particularly in Tulkarem, Jenin, and Tobas, is deeply concerning. We deplore all such acts, including the killing of civilians by any actor. Mr. President, the toll on civilians in Gaza, especially women and children, continues to shock the global conscience. Sierra Leone stands firm in its commitment to the UN Charter and to the fundamental principles of peace, justice, and human dignity. Accordingly, we must collectively recognize that the situation unfolding in Gaza now bears many of the hallmarks of mass atrocity crimes. The risk is not theoretical. It is real, credible, and escalating. Given our experience, we understand too well the consequences of delayed international action or inaction. We also recall with painful clarity the global failure to prevent the mass atrocities in Rwanda and Srebrenica, subsequently declared as genocide by competent international courts. The International Court of Justice, in its landmark decisions, has underscored the legal and moral duty to act to prevent genocide. The obligation to prevent genocide is not discretionary. It is a preemptory norm of international law, binding on all states. It imposes duty not only to refrain from committing such crimes, but to take active, timely measures to avert them. Presently, we face a moment no less consequential. We are deeply alarmed by the consistent report of indiscriminate bombardment, destruction of vital infrastructure, deprivation of humanitarian assistance, and inflammatory rhetoric. These patterns may contribute to creating conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a group in whole or in part, which is explicitly prohibited under the Genocide Convention, which codifies customary international law. We therefore call for the immediate and unimpeded humanitarian access and for urgent international action to forestall further deterioration of the situation. The closure of crossings and the obstruction of aid are unacceptable and must be reversed without delay. The complicity of the international community must not be repeated. Further, the provision of humanitarian aid must be fully aligned with the established humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These principles are not only foundational to the effectiveness of aid delivery, but essential to ensuring that assistance reaches those in greatest need. Aid must never be instrumentalized as a tool of war or subjected to conditionalities that compromise the dignity or survival of affected populations. The integrity of humanitarian operations must be protected at all times, and all parties must allow for safe, timely and unhindered access for humanitarian actors in accordance with IHL. Mr. President, in January 2024, the International Court of Justice issued provisional measures in the case South Africa versus Israel, directing the State of Israel to take all necessary steps to prevent acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention. On 24 May 2024, these measures were expanded to include halting the military offensive in Rafah and allowing humanitarian access. Sierra Leone underscores that these orders are binding. Compliance is not a matter of political discretion, but a legal imperative. Failure to do so threatens the legitimacy of the International Court of Justice and undermines the credibility of the rules-based international system. Colleagues, at the core of the current catastrophe lies a crisis of accountability. The scale of suffering endured by civilians in Gaza and in the state of Israel must not go unaddressed. Perpetrators of grave violation of international law must be held responsible. Sierra Leone believes that upholding international law is indispensable to restoring justice and preventing further atrocities. This Council, therefore, cannot remain silent. The Council must act with the clarity and conviction that this moment demands. The credibility of the Council and the lives of the thousands of civilians depend on it. Sierra Leone urges a renewed commitment to this Council's charter responsibilities, particularly in preventing atrocity crimes and upholding international humanitarian law. In the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda and in the Pact for the Future, calls have been made for a more predictable and principled approach to early warning, prevention, and accountability. These frameworks must be operationalized through consistent Council engagement and action, including through veto restraint initiatives, particularly in contexts where the risk of mass atrocity is acute. Mr. President, as we call for urgent action on mass atrocity risk, Sierra Leone affirms that only a political solution can bring sustainable peace. We reiterate our support for the two-state solution, with an independent state of Palestine living side by side with the state of Israel in peace and security. While humanitarian actions are vital, they are no substitute for a sustainable diplomatic process. Ceasefire, release of hostages, and the lifting of humanitarian blockades must be the starting point. We commend the diplomatic efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, and urge for continued mediation. We call on the parties to act with urgency and in good faith. Sierra Leone believes that unless the root causes of occupation, settlement expansion, and political exclusion are addressed, durable peace will remain elusive. We affirm our full support for a negotiated, just, grounded in international law and the relevant UN resolutions. This conflict has inflicted immense suffering, claimed countless lives, and seen too many missed opportunities for peace. The collapse of the ceasefire in March alone resulted in over 3,500 additional civilian deaths, with more than 50 hostages still held in captivity. The international community bears a collective responsibility not only to halt the mayhem, but to foster the conditions for lasting coexistence and peace. We therefore conclude by urging this Security Council to act. We also urge the Council to ensure full respect for international law, accountability for all serious violations, and protection for all civilians, regardless of identity. Let us not allow this moment to pass with inaction or equivocation. The credibility of this Council and the lives of thousands depend on what we choose to do now. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process ad interim Sigrid Kaag for the briefing on the situation in Gaza, as well as Dr. Sidwa for his testimony. We wish to take this opportunity to extend our solidarity with the Humanitarian Coordinator, Tom Fletcher, in connection with the attacks that targeted him after his latest briefing at the Security Council of the United Nations. Mr. President, every new day brings with it tragic news from the Palestine-Israel conflict zone. News headlines are broadcasting the horrific shattering of new records. The number of dead children and women, journalists, humanitarian workers is staggering. Strikes targeting schools and hospitals are no longer shocking to anybody. They have long ago become the living nightmare of the residents of the Gaza Strip, and one can only guess at the conditions being endured in Gaza by those who stand ready to selflessly fulfill their humanitarian duty before the Palestinian people. Despite this, the hope for the possibility of a peaceful resolution to the conflict and the restoration of the January deal, which has been kindled by reports about the intense efforts undertaken by mediators, this hope was still alive. However, this hope was not fated to come to pass. On 16 May, Israel launched the Gideon's Chariots operation, which has further exacerbated the suffering endured by peaceful Palestinian civilians. The biblical name belies the brutal aim of this operation, that is control Gaza, the cleansing of the north of the enclave, of the north of the strip from its residents, and their forcible displacements to the south. Already today, the IDF controls 77% of the territory of the Gaza Strip. With the resumption of hostilities in March, nearly 4,000 Palestinians have been killed, and since October 2023, nearly 54,000 people have been killed, 123,000 have been wounded. The military operation has in no way yet helped to resolve the issue of the hostages. The only hostage who was released recently, the U.S.-Israeli citizen Idan Alexander, was handed over by Hamas representatives as a gesture of goodwill. Another 33 hostages were able to return to their homes and reunite with their loved ones as a result of a deal which was reached in January. And the fates of the other hostages against the backdrop of the active military operations in the Strip remains uncertain. Mr. President, the untold suffering endured by the Palestinian population and the remaining hostages is the result of the humanitarian blockade of Gaza, which Israel imposed on 2 March. Despite the sporadic weakening by the Israeli side of the blockade, as a result of which last week permission was granted for the entry of 400 trucks with assistance, despite that, the blockade has effectively been ongoing. Assistance which is permitted to enter is merely a drop in the bucket against the backdrop of the staggering needs. Let us recall, even before the blockade, in order to meet and address the humanitarian situation in the Strip, there was a need to bring in, at the minimum, 600 trucks every day. Today, the situation is far more catastrophic. Food supplies are dwindling. Most medicines and medical supplies have been depleted, and there's an acute shortage of fuel in order to provide for operations of basic infrastructure. People are desperate. We have seen what happened at the assistance distribution point, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation point. The humanitarian structures working on the ground unanimously proclaimed their readiness and have been proclaiming their readiness, and most importantly, their ability to provide the Gazan people with all basic goods and services as soon as Israel lifts the blockade and removes any and all obstacles for the delivery and distribution of humanitarian assistance, which the UN Secretariat and the majority of the membership of the Council, including the Russian Federation, categorically condemn. Israel's proposed plan
flies in the face of humanitarian principles. This plan disregards the needs of certain categories of citizens, including those residing in remote regions, and on the whole, this jeopardizes the lives of both Palestinians and humanitarian workers. We are equally concerned by the ongoing IDF Iron Wall operation in the West bank of the Jordan River, as well as clashes between Israeli troops, settlers, and local civilians. Military operations are engulfing Burkin, Jenin, Tulkarm, Husan, as well as Nablus's and Hebron's environs. Israelis are simultaneously demolishing Palestinian property and carrying out mass arrests of Palestinian civilians. Just recently, at least 40 Palestinians have been detained. Interreligious hatred is being fomented by Israeli leadership's provocative actions, including visits to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound by approximately 1,500 radical right-wing Israelis who were accompanied by the Minister of National Security of Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Attempts by Western Jerusalem to violate the legal and historical status quo of the holy city's sacred site are illegal and unacceptable. Mr. President, today we are observing a clash of two realities with growing distance between them. On the one hand, there are loud calls from the international community for there to be respect for international humanitarian law, a ceasefire, the release of detained persons, and the implementation of the two-state solution. On the other hand, Israel's singular focus on achieving all political through military means alone. They have no scruples about selecting their means and no qualms about loss of civilians until Gaza is completely razed to the ground. In this reality, there is room only for war and Old Testament brutality. What can we do to align the reality on the ground and the aspirations of the august bodies of the United Nations? For that, the international community needs to undertake meaningful efforts to facilitate the resolution to the root cause of the protracted conflict, the fact that the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to establish their own independent state within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel, has not been upheld. This will become possible only following the immediate return to the peace process on the universally recognized international legal basis, at the heart of which was and remains the cornerstone, 2 states for 2 people's principle. As the most urgent step to that end, the UN Security Council should send a clear message to the parties about the unconditional cessation of hostilities and to achieve the lifting by Israel of the humanitarian blockade, and this would create favorable conditions for the release of the remaining hostages and detainees, and this would facilitate the resumption of the peace process for Palestinian-Israeli settlement. The tragedy that is occurring before our very eyes in Gaza is, among other things, the consequence of insufficient resolve on the part of the international community to ensure the enforcement of their own resolutions on the establishment of 2 states, Israel and Palestine. Despite the exceedingly difficult context, reciprocal recriminations, and emotions running high, we believe that we need to achieve having these 2 peoples surmount decades of hostility and to achieve peace, stability, and prosperity for the entire Middle East region. Any other scenarios harbor grave risks, not just for the region, but for all of humankind. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also begin by thanking Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her comprehensive briefing today. And we are also grateful to Dr. Firoz Sidwa for his sobering remarks. Those were harrowing details, unimaginable, so difficult to listen to and grasp, and one would shudder to think how all those on ground, all those women and children, and doctors and humanitarian workers would be coping with that situation on a daily basis. Mr. President, my delegation would also at the outset recall and reaffirm its complete support to the briefings, the objective and truthful and responsible statements by senior UN officials, including USG Tom Fletcher, before this Council. In our view, any undue criticism of their work must be unacceptable. Mr. President, we meet yet again under the shadow of a deepening yet preventable tragedy in Gaza, one that tests not only our conscience, but the very credibility of this Council. This is not a natural disaster. It is a man-made catastrophe. As we heard from both briefers today and many other Council members, this is a man-made catastrophe driven by Israel, the occupying powers' unrelenting, illegal blockade of Gaza, and the callous bombardment and deliberate killings carried out with full impunity. The numbers are staggering. More than 54,000 Palestinians have been killed, majority of them children and women. Over 122,000 have been injured. Gaza's people face continuous indiscriminate assault from land, air, and sea. The psychological and societal trauma is beyond measure, beyond imagination. This is without question one of the gravest humanitarian crises of our times. Mr. President, how many more atrocities must be committed before this Council does what is right, morally, legally, and under the UN Charter? Words of concern are no longer enough. The time to act, the time to prevent genocide is now. As Dr. Sidwa said, we must not allow these atrocities to be normalized, for that would be an affront to international law and human dignity. To grasp the scale of this catastrophe, let me highlight 4 urgent dimensions of the suffering in Gaza. First, the health and medical system has collapsed. It has in fact been systematically destroyed and dismantled. Hospitals are overwhelmed, operating without fuel, without sanitation, without essential supplies. More than 800 health facilities and assets have been attacked. Medical workers have been killed, ambulances destroyed. This is the systematic erasure of the right to health and to life. Second, famine is no longer a threat. It is here. In Gaza, at least 57 children have already died of hunger. 1 in 5 Gazans could face starvation. Humanitarian convoys are being blocked or attacked. Relief workers are being targeted. Starvation is being weaponized flagrantly and illegally. Third, Gaza's civilian infrastructure lies in ruins. Water systems are destroyed. Electricity is cut. Communications are blacked out. More than 80% of homes have been destroyed. Most of Gaza now lies within a militarized zone. This is not collateral damage. It is deliberate, orchestrated destruction designed to break the will of the Palestinian people to survive. Fourth, the toll on women and children is unspeakable. According to UN Women, over 28,000 women and girls have been killed, 1 every hour since October. 50,000 women are pregnant. Next month, more than 5,000 will give birth. many in tents, on the streets, without electricity, clean water, or medical care. And while Gaza is being decimated, the West Bank remains under siege. Displacement is rising. Movement is restricted. Violence by settlers continues unchecked. In just the past 4 months, Israeli occupying forces have killed more than 130 Palestinians. Homes are being demolished. Arbitrary arrests continue. We also strongly condemn the provocative visits by Israeli officials to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, violations of the legal and historical status quo. These inflammatory actions threaten to ignite wider regional tensions. The sanctity of Al-Aqsa must be upheld in line with international law and UN resolutions. Mr. President, against this grim background, we call for 4 urgent steps. First, an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. Resolution 2735 must be implemented in full. All attacks on civilians must end. We support all continuing efforts to restore the ceasefire. Second, the full and immediate lifting of the Gaza blockade. Humanitarian teams must operate safely and without obstruction. The current trickle of aid is wholly inadequate and unjustifiable. This Council must demand immediate and unconditional removal of all restrictions on the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza and its safe and unhindered distribution at scale, including by the UN and humanitarian partners, including UNRWA, throughout Gaza Strip, in full compliance with international humanitarian law. Third, any forced displacement of the Palestinians from the Palestinian land must be strongly rejected. Fourth, we must address the root cause, the prolonged occupation and denial of the Palestinians' right to self-determination and statehood. A just peace demands a two-state solution based on pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as the capital of an independent and sovereign Palestinian state. The conference next month, to be co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, offers a unique opportunity to move concretely and irreversibly in that direction, an objective that is clearly supported by the overwhelming majority of the international community. Mr. President, while that action will take place in the General Assembly, this Council cannot remain a bystander. It must act in accordance with its mandate to protect civilians under siege, to uphold international law, and to speak and to be on the side of the oppressed. The time for equivocation is over. There is no justification whatsoever for the human suffering of the Palestinian people. Yes, we agree, enough is enough. The cries from Gaza cannot continue to be met with silence. The world cannot afford another day of inaction. History will surely not absolve us of our responsibility. Mr. President, the sense around the table is clear. The urgent asks are so evident. Ceasefire, release of hostages, humanitarian action, and protection of innocent civilians. All of this is doable. We call on all Council members to come together, to act through a resolution, to promote this objective in the immediate term, and to help create an environment conducive for the June conference and ultimately towards a just and lasting settlement of the Palestinian question. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Pakistan for his statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank the Special Coordinator at Interim CARG and Dr. Sidwa for their briefings. Since May the 16th, Israel has continued to intensify its military offensive in Gaza, which has completely destroyed large, densely populated areas and caused the death of more than 1,000 Gazans in the past 2 weeks alone. The question is repeatedly asked, when will this conflict end? Over the past 600 days, northern, central, and southern Gaza have been ravaged by war, claiming the lives of more than 54,000 people. The population of Gaza has been forcefully displaced time and again. The Security Council and the GA have adopted multiple resolutions calling for an immediate ceasefire, but the conflict has not yet subsided, and the engine of war is still roaring. Continued prolongation of the fighting will not lead to the release of hostages, but only to more death and hatred. The question has been repeatedly asked, are there no limits to the means of this conflict? Even wars have rules. Compliance with international humanitarian law is an undeniable obligation of all parties. In Gaza, however, we have witnessed the red lines of the international law and the bottom line of human morality repeatedly violated and breached. Humanitarian assistance has been weaponized, with 2 million people plunged into extreme hunger as a result of the prolonged blockade. Schools, hospitals, refugee camps, and UN facilities have been targeted. Journalists and humanitarian workers have been mercilessly killed. Securing humanitarian assistance is an obligation of the occupying power under international law. All assistance must adhere to the principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality. Safety of civilian facilities and humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. All attacks must be strictly investigated and perpetrators held accountable. People were again asking the question, are the Palestinian people to be forced to lose their homes once again? Gaza is in ruins, with living conditions severely jeopardized. Recently, there have been repeated calls from the Israeli side for completely destroying and taking over of all of Gaza. The Israeli army already controls more than 70% of Gaza. At the same time, continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank and intensified settler violence gravely limits the space for the Palestinian people to survive. Changing the demographic and territorial composition of Gaza, as well as settlement activities, are in violation of the Security Council resolutions and international law. The annexation of Gaza and the West Bank will completely take away the prospects for peace in the Middle East. In the face of such questions, China firmly reiterates that a durable ceasefire in Gaza cannot be delayed, and that Israel must immediately cease all military operations. Believing the humanitarian catastrophe is immediate, Israel must lift the blockade, fully restore humanitarian access, and support UN and other international humanitarian organizations in the efforts to provide assistance. China appreciates and will continue to support the work of USG Fletcher. Gaza and the West Bank are an integral part of the state of Palestine. The international community must firmly oppose any attempt to annex the territories of Gaza or the West Bank and oppose forced displacement of the population of Gaza. The United States, as a country with significant influence over the parties involved, should act in a fair and responsible manner and take effective and forceful action. The Security Council bears the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security.
Algeria and other members of the Council are currently working on a new draft resolution. China supports the Council's efforts to take effective action to promote a durable ceasefire and alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe. President, implementation of the two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the question of Palestine. The international community must step up its efforts to promote the political process for this two-state solution. We look forward to the high-level conference on the implementation of the two-state solution to be held in June, and hope it will provide new impetus to the prospect for realizing the two-state solution. China will continue to make joint efforts with the international community to promote the quelling of fighting in Gaza, alleviate humanitarian catastrophe, realize a comprehensive, just and lasting solution to the question of Palestine, and restore peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the Permanent Representative of China for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for the important briefings, and I also thank Dr. Feroz Sidwa for his compelling testimonies and your devotions on the ground. Mr. President, the current violence and suffering unfolding in Gaza for the last 19 months makes us doubt that we are now living in the 21st century. The recent killing of Yakin Hamad, an 11-year-old girl, bravely helping the delivery of humanitarian aid to her neighbors and reporting her survival through social media, exemplifies again the urgent need to immediately end this conflict. As we demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other militant groups, we urge Israel to stop bombing, which is indiscriminately killing scores of Palestinian civilians and destroying the entire Gaza Strip. The Republic of Korea also reiterates its firm support for the efforts by mediating countries, namely Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to secure a desperately needed resumption of the ceasefire. We appeal to both Hamas and Israel to faithfully engage with the mediators for an immediate ceasefire and release of all remaining hostages. Mr. President, we remain deeply concerned by the new modalities of the humanitarian aid in Gaza, which reportedly started operations at a severely limited number of militarized locations earlier this week. We reiterate our fundamental position that Israel has a legal obligation to allow the swift and unimpeded flow of aid throughout Gaza, with full respect to the humanitarian principles and in full cooperation with trusted humanitarian agencies, including the UN. In this regard, we call on Israel to listen to the principled voices of humanitarian workers, including the former executive director of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, who tendered his resignation because, I quote, "It could not adhere to the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence," unquote. Not only food, but also other necessities, including medicine and medical equipment, water, sanitation, shelters, and fuel, all are desperate need. Such aid, severely limited in both quantity and access, cannot provide adequate relief to 2 million people in Gaza. Innocent civilians do not deserve such inhumane treatment. Also concerning is that Israel's humanitarian aid plan would lead to the forcible displacement of hungry Palestinian civilians in Gaza by coercing them directly through the promise of withheld food and humanitarian aid to move to areas by the distribution sites. Also unjustifiable is using civilians and civilian infrastructure by both state and non-state actors as human shields. While we demand an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, we also strongly demand all parties to this conflict adhere to their obligation under international humanitarian law and to hold responsible those who violate them. Mr. President, turning to the worsening situation in the West Bank, we reiterate our call for an immediate de-escalation and full respect for international law and relevant Security Council resolutions. Last week, incidents where Israeli soldiers fired warning shots at dozens of diplomats visiting the city of Jenin in the northern West Bank clearly shows that under the current occupation with severe military operations, no one, not even foreign diplomats, are safe. Under international humanitarian law, the occupying power must maintain the status quo, as detailed in Resolution 2334. Israel should cease all settlement activities in the OPT, including East Jerusalem, and any incitement and inflammatory rhetoric, especially vis-à-vis holy sites in Jerusalem, must stop. The Republic of Korea expresses its deep concern over Israel's recent approvals for the construction of new settlements in the West Bank. As the construction of settlements is against international law and undermines its viability of the two-state solution, the Republic of Korea calls on Israel to reverse its relevant decisions. In addition, we express concern over the repeated incendiary remarks and acts by senior Israeli officials, including recent visits to holy sites, unilateral actions, and incitement against UNRWA, the UN mandate agency, must also stop. Mr. President, we empathize with the international community on the concern of eroding vision of the two-state solution. By perpetuating the continuation of violence and agony or denying the existence of future of neighbors, a just and durable peace cannot be obtained. Sadly, the reality today, shown in a harrowing video of a little girl walking in flames after Israeli airstrikes targeting a shelter-turned school, is the opposite. The Republic of Korea thus reiterates its call for an end to the bloodshed and the release of hostages, and reaffirms its steadfast support for the two-state solution, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace, security, and dignity. As a UN Security Council member, the Republic of Korea will actively participate in discussions, including the high-level conference in June, to secure peace and revive a viable path toward the resumption of a political horizon based on the two-state solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Greece. I wish to thank Special Coordinator Mrs. Kag for her detailed briefing today, as well as Dr. Shidwa. Colleagues, it has been only a week since our last discussion at the open debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflicts, where Member States emphatically referred to the unacceptable humanitarian situation in Gaza, with the most vulnerable groups, women and children, suffering the most. A child never starts a war, and yet, as Sophocles reminds us, war loves to seek its victims in the young. Thousands of children have been killed, wounded, separated from their families, deprived of the basic rights to grow up healthy, and stripped of their dreams for a better future. which each passing day more Palestinians are at risk of dying, falling thousands. The latest IPC report clearly warns of an entire population at critical risk of famine. Hundreds face the risk of succumbing to the injuries as hospitals have either suspended the operation or have been shut down. All this suffering could end with a ceasefire and full access to humanitarian assistance. While we welcome the partial resumption of aid delivery into the Strip, it is hardly sufficient. Much more is needed as the population has been denied access to food, medicine and other critical supplies for almost 3 months now. Blocking aid as a pressure lever is unacceptable. Expanded military operations in Gaza worsen the humanitarian situation. This action will only prolong the suffering of the Palestinians while doing nothing to serve the long-term interest of peace and security in the region. We urge Israel to allow the immediate, full, unhindered flow of humanitarian aid at scale into all parts of the Strip, as it is clearly dictated by international law. Access to electricity and water must be fully restored as well. Dialogue and coordination with the UN and its agencies remain critical in this regard. We share the concerns expressed by UN colleagues at proposals to establish a new mechanism for the delivery of aid which would not meet basic humanitarian principles. We cannot support a scheme which does not prioritize the needs of civilians, undermines the UN's ability to operate independently, excludes specific parts of Gaza, and increases further instability and insecurity. At the same time, we are gravely concerned by the attacks on humanitarian aid workers. These people have chosen to serve humanity at the risk of their own lives. Hence, the safety and security must be guaranteed at all times in accordance with international humanitarian law. We strongly condemned incidents of anti-Semitism, including the recent deadly shooting in Washington, D.C., which claimed the life of 2 embassy staff members. We extend our condolences and solidarity to the families and to the State of Israel. Turning to the West Bank, we strongly condemn the incident with shots fired during a visit of foreign diplomats in Jenin, and we accept this incident to be fully investigated and accountability clearly assigned. We also deplore the increase of settlement activity and violence. Hostages are still suffering at the hands of Hamas. We reiterate a strong condemnation for the cruel treatment of the hostages and our position that all hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Colleagues, peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding. Both parties need to strive for a permanent, sustainable ceasefire, as well as to revitalize the political process with the ultimate goal of achieving a two-state solution in accordance with the relevant Security Council resolutions. In this way, both Palestinians and Israelis will finally be able to live side by side in peace and security. In this regard, we look forward to the upcoming June conference under the co-presidency of France and Saudi Arabia as an important contribution toward the ultimate goal of a two-state solution. We also welcome the Arab plan for the reconstruction of Gaza as presented by Egypt, reconfirming the leading role of a reformed Palestinian Authority to be essential in planning the day after. There is no alternative partner for peace than a reformed and empowered Palestinian Authority capable of exerting effective governance over the West Bank and eventually Gaza, where Hamas will have no role in security of governments and will no longer be in a position to threaten Israel. In concluding, colleagues, it is evident that no good can come out of violence. It is crucial to break the vicious circle of violence that has plagued the region for decades and give voice through dialogue to peace, stability and prosperity. I thank you. I resume now my functions as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting and thank UN Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her important briefing and her efforts. I also express our deep appreciation to Dr. Ferouz Sidwa for his compelling briefing, for his service to save wounded Palestinians, especially children in Gaza, and for his appeals for an end to this brutal war on our people. Let me also reiterate our support and gratitude to the Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, to Tom Fletcher, to Mr. Lazzarini, and many others including the heroic staff of the UN in defending, serving, and saving lives at the expense of theirs. Mr. President, there is cruelty in the bombardments, cruelty in the wanton destruction, cruelty in the blockade, and even cruelty in the distribution of very limited aid. We will be asked, how can you complain about food finally being delivered after having complained about starvation and famine? Isn't it any aid better than no aid at all? Who said these should be our choices? The doomed fate of our people. A full blockade against an entire civilian population, including 1 million children, depriving them of food, water, medicine, shelter, or a system of aid that is degrading, discriminatory, limited to food and limited in quantity, and which aims at the forcible displacement of the population and at facilitating the unlawful seizing of land. Do you know how we know this is the objective? Israeli officials are openly telling the world that this is their intention. Statement after statement, threat after threat. After seeing starvation used as a weapon of war, now we see aid being used as a weapon of war. Should we remain silent because the alternative is worse? Or should we stand up for the humanity of Palestinians, of all civilians in any situation of armed conflict? The images of hungry, desperate people storming out of the cages they were forced into in order to get aid is gut-wrenching and heartbreaking. These are people, human beings, deprived of water, food, medicine for so long and hanging to life by a thread. This is outraging the Palestinian people, all of them, including me. It is outrageous to see this situation and still you are not acting. How much more do you want? Israel wants to appear as allowing aid in, while continuing to make sure life cannot actually be sustained in Gaza. If Israel wanted aid in, it would open the crossings and allow humanitarian aid to enter immediately and fully, in coordination with the UN, including UNRWA, which proved during the ceasefire its ability to deliver aid to all those in need throughout the Gaza Strip. The UN plan, with its proven humanitarian obligations and principles, and it has all necessary safeguards, if that is the true concern. But the true concern is how to get rid of the Palestinians by killing them, starving them, and destroying Gaza so they have no choice but to leave if they want to live. In his speech yesterday, Netanyahu said two truths. The first is a Freudian slip, and I quote, "When you try to target civilians, you invariably hit civilians." End of quotation. And indeed, Israel has been hitting civilians. The second truth is, and I quote, you always demonize before you annihilate. Let me repeat it. You always demonize before you annihilate. End of quotation. He was saying that as a historical lesson for all. What did he say about Gaza? And I quote, this is the war of good against evil, the beginning of a determined war that is being waged on the battlefield. It is being waged against the human animals, that's us, against the monsters, that's us, that attacked us with hideous brutality 20 months ago, and we will defeat them and annihilate them. They will not remain. They will not remain. End of quotation. He repeated yesterday, and I quote, this is a war of civilization against barbarism. End of quotation. We have to ask, is it civilized to bomb indiscriminately, to commit daily massacres, to kill entire families, to destroy all the requirements of life and survival for over 2 million people, including 1 million children? Is it civilized to blockade and to starve a people? If this is civilized, what is barbarism then? Is it civilized to bomb schools, serving as shelters for displaced civilians? When you see the images of 6-year-old Ward al-Sheikh Khalil, the first question should be, how did she find herself amidst the flames, which my brother Ammar showed you the picture? It is because of an Israeli strike on a school turned into a shelter. 36 people were killed in that strike, mostly women and children. Ward survived, but her mother and 5 of her siblings did not make it out of the burning buildings. And again, my brother Ammar showed you the pictures. She will forever have to live with that trauma. And as the distinguished brother Feroz told us, 50% of those who are under 5 years old are not looking for life. They are looking for death because they cannot bear the pain of losing so many of dear ones, of their families and siblings. If we stop this genocide before she is killed too, Ward. Dr. Najjar, who was honoring her noble mission as a doctor trying to save lives, saw her children as they arrived to the hospital, their bodies burned and already dead. She lost 9 of her 10 children. A horror and trauma the mind cannot comprehend. The heart cannot withstand. Since Israel broke the ceasefire in March, over 1,000 Palestinian children have been killed, and around 4,000 have been injured. These are children. Children. And still, a war against barbarism. Children. dozens of children are dying of starvation. The images of mothers embracing their motionless bodies, caressing their hair, talking to them, apologizing to them, is unbearable. How could anyone tolerate this harm? Excuse me, Mr. President. I have grandchildren. I know what they mean to their families. And to see this situation of the Palestinians without us having hearts to do something is beyond the ability of any normal human being to tolerate. Flames and hunger are devouring Palestinian children. This is why we are so outraged as Palestinians everywhere, the 14 millions of us in the occupied territories, in the diaspora, in the refugee camps, in far places, all the way to California and in between. We love our children. We love our people. We don't want to see them going through this tragedy and this savage attacks by those who claim the virtues of fighting against barbarism. But Netanyahu mocks claims of starvation in Gaza, despite the overwhelming evidence. And what proof does he rely on? That Israel takes thousands of prisoners and photograph them half naked, and that you can see they are not starving. He is speaking of the prisoners parked in trucks by the hundreds, or in the open last winter and the one before, including children. More inhumane and cruel treatment, more dehumanization, more disregard for basic human decency. Netanyahu claims that Israel is supplying the population with essential requirements: food, water, medicine. That's why he, and I quote him, that's why you didn't have mass starvation at all, he says. This is the same Netanyahu that decided to impose the total blockade that the people in Gaza endured over the last 10 weeks, deliberately denying them water, food, medicine, and shelter. This is the same Netanyahu who congratulated Smotrich, who, after the decision of allowing some aid declared, and I quote, "Now we until Hamas is destroyed. Along the way, what remains of the Gaza Strip is also being wiped out, simply because everything there has become one big terror city." End of quotation. The same Smotrich who spoke of the expansion of Israel's border on all fronts, inciting the crowd of Israeli extremists storming the streets of the old city of Jerusalem and Al-Haram al-Sharif on the so-called Jerusalem Day. Smotrich shouted, "Are we afraid of the world occupation?" meaning thinking of the situation there. He shouts, "Are we afraid of the world?" The crowd answered, "No, we are not afraid." Are we settling the land of Israel? Are we liberating Gaza? The crowd cheered. Netanyahu said the objective of this destruction, Netanyahu said that the objective of this distribution mechanism was to have a sterile zone in the south of Gaza where the entire population can move. And he has repeatedly said that Israel wants to depopulate Gaza, calling it voluntary migration, the code name for ethnic cleansing, and to take control of Gaza. So what should we all do? Pretend we cannot see? We cannot hear? Netanyahu is asking us not to believe his own statements, not to believe that the actions he took actually took place. He is asking you to redefine all of international law to fit Israeli crimes, to enable these atrocities. He is asking you to accept, to bargain with people's lives and with our existence as a nation, and with peace and security for all in our region. He wants to define the terms at the expense of everybody else. His political survival relies on it. We all know this. We have known it for a long time. Nearly 200,000 casualties between killed, injured, and have been the consequence of this. So what should be condemned? Genocidal statements and actions, or statements and actions to prevent the genocide? What should we condemn? There should be no character assassination of those who stand against these brutal policies, while those behind them are never held to account. We should see the truth. We should see clearly. For our part, our position is clear and unequivocal. Nothing can justify attacking civilians, whether Palestinians or Israelis. Double standards no more. We are human beings. We are proud Palestinians. We sit around this table. We should be treated exactly like everybody else. Not to see what you want to see in the mirror and to ignore the obvious, the huge elephant in the room, the Palestinian people. Be fair. Use one stick of measurement. We are like the rest of you, all of you. Don't have a system of measurements for one group and pretend the others do not exist. We do exist. And although I love Mansour, the Palestinian artist, who my sister, Sigrid referred to him, we will never wither away, we will not go as Palestine. Although he said in that famous artwork that he see that Palestine is withering away. But he probably was referring to settlements and other issues. But I can assure you, we are rooted in Palestine more than the olive trees, the Roman ones, rooted in Palestine. We will never go away. We will not wither away. We are staying in our homeland, and we will attain our inalienable rights, hopefully sooner than later. Okay. For our part, our position is clear and unequivocal. Nothing can justify attacking civilians, whether Palestinians or Israelis. We reject dehumanization and double standards. Palestinian lives are not less important, less sacred, less worthy of protection. Mr. President, President Trump, together with Egypt and Qatar, is making every effort towards a permanent ceasefire that could end the killing, release hostages and prisoners, begin to end the horrific humanitarian situation, lead to the withdrawal of Israeli forces. The Palestinian Authority is ready to fully assume its responsibilities in the Gaza Strip, both in terms of governance and security, with international support and presence. President Trump said he wants to see peace prevail in the region. That is the Trump plan, not the distorted version promoted by Netanyahu to pursue the war. It is time for all states to do what is necessary to end this genocide, break this siege, end this illegal occupation, achieve the independence of the state of Palestine and the two-state solution and peace. That will be for the benefit of all states and all peoples, Palestinians and Israelis and the entire region. If the Security Council does not act, there is nothing that prevents you from acting in your national capacity. Act in your national capacity. Do something. Stop this crime from continuing against the Palestinian people, this genocide. Let's not try to shift the blames of those who are not acting. Show us your true character, your commitment to international law, your commitment to justice. You can act. And by acting in your national capacity also, you might inspire the Security Council to act in its collective, powerful capacity. This is not a so-called reward or gift. This is the right of the Palestinian people to life, to live as a free people, to live in peace, security, and with human dignity in their homeland, side by side, in peace and security with Israel. These decisions can no longer be deferred. States must act within these halls at the national level, collectively, and at the upcoming international conference in June. They need to show that their resolve far outweighs the will and sinister plans of the enemies of peace. Free Palestine, as hundreds of millions of people are screaming in the streets in every corner of the globe. Free our region from occupation and wars. It has all gone on for far too long. The human toll and suffering are more unbearable than ever. There must be an immediate ceasefire. There must be unimpeded humanitarian aid and protection for our people. Hostages and detainees must be released. The forced displacement of the Palestinian people and annexation of Palestinian land must be stopped. Save Gaza, save Palestine, save the two-state solution, save peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. What? No? Yes. Okay. I see that the representative of the United States has asked the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I just would like to very briefly respond to some of the comments that we just heard, and to say that Israel does have the right to defend itself and has taken numerous measures to limit harm to civilians and address humanitarian needs. And while the loss of civilian life in Gaza is tragic, the responsibility for this rests with Hamas, which could stop the fighting today by freezing the hostages freeing the hostages, and green to the ceasefire terms already accepted by Israel. Thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement. And now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Mansour, you mentioned our Prime Minister many times in your speech, your long speech. I want to remind you the words of our former Prime Minister, Golda Meir, who served 50 years ago in this position, and she said that peace will come when you will love your children more than you hate us. Mr. President, a bright young couple in their 20s were in the prime of their lives dedicated to diplomacy. Yaron Lishinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram were stars in Israel's foreign service, working in the diplomatic team at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. They were deeply in love. Yaron was planning to propose to Sarah this week in Jerusalem, but they never made it to Jerusalem. A week ago, last Wednesday night, as they were leaving an event for young diplomats hosted by the Capital Jewish Museum, they were shot dead, murdered by a terrorist screaming, "Free Palestine, free Palestine." This was a targeted anti-Semitic assassination of two Israeli diplomats on American soil. This was anti-Semitic terrorism of the most horrific order. It was an act of pure evil. The animal who pulled the trigger was just the final link in a chain of incitement that stretches across social media, across university campuses, across valleys, and yes, across the floor of this very council. The blood of Yaron and Sarah is not only on the shooter's hands, it is on every official, every influencer, every academic, every anti-Semite, every so-called expert who has spent the last 19 months portraying Israel as a genocidal regime and terrorists as freedom fighters. But we cannot talk about such recklessness without talking about Mr. Tom Fletcher, who sat here a few weeks ago. Mr. Fletcher has assumed the role of moral preacher. His speeches and statements drip with pomposity and self-righteousness, but not a shred of responsibility. Just a few weeks ago, in this chamber, he accused Israel of genocide. I have demanded the retract of this baseless and vile accusation, but he has not so far. As if that was not outrageous enough, he declared just 2 days before Yaron and Sarah's murder that, quote, and I quote him directly, "There are 14,000 babies in Gaza that will die in the next 48 hours. And you should have seen the way he spoke. Some information that we don't have. The claim was a lie. It had no basis in fact, and yet it was broadcast across social media, fueling the already terrible anti-Semitism. Of course, as we all know, 14,000 babies did not die in those 48 hours, but 2 innocent Jews did. Mr. Fletcher was forced to retract that lie after the BBC corrected him. But retractions don't put the bullets back in the gun. They don't bring back Yaron and Sarah. They don't erase the damage done by those who slander the Jewish state without a second thought, without thinking before speaking. Mr. Fletcher, when you engage in blood libels, do not act surprised when blood is spilled in the streets. This is what happens when anti-Semitic propaganda is filtered through the language of human rights. That is what happens when terms like genocide are thrown around like political weapons, stripped of meaning and used to demonize Jews. This council has become a megaphone for that hate, a place where the worst actors in the international system use the banner of justice to justify violence. A place where the representative of Libya can sit at this very table and desecrate the memory of the Holocaust by calling Gaza, and I quote, 21st century Holocaust. That isn't just distortion, it is Holocaust denial. And yet, there was no condemnation for most of you sitting here. You faced no consequences. At the United Nations, statements like that are tolerated and sometimes even applauded. But don't mistake the applause for morality. Words have consequences. And the murder of two young Israeli diplomats is not detached from what happens in this room. It is the logical end of your narrative. The people who chant from the river to the sea are not separate from the people who sit here in suits and ties and accuse Israel of genocide. They are part of the same machine. One provides the lies, the other pulls the trigger. Unfortunately, Mr. Fletcher is not the exception, he is the rule. He is representative of a class of UN officials and so-called neutral experts who have built careers out of moral posturing while taking no responsibility for the consequences of their words. They are very good at that. They speak in sound bites, they issue dramatic proclamations, and then when those proclamations incite hate and violence, they vanish. They deny any role in the bloodshed. Well, we will not let them evade responsibility. We will expose them. Even a day ago, I think Mr. Fletcher came with another provocation. He said 10,000 tracts are waiting to enter Gaza. I don't know if you saw that, only recently. You know what will happen if you line up 10,000 tracts from the border of Gaza? The line will go all the way to Lebanon. So how can you throw numbers like that? You can say there are issues, you can say about public, but saying 14,000 babies, 10,000 tracts, genocide, so easy. Mr. President, while the UN spreads panic and makes declarations detached from reality, the State of Israel is steadily facilitating the entry of aid into Gaza via two methods. First, under the old framework via tracks, and second, under the new distribution mechanism developed in coordination with the US and key international partners. As of now, both mechanisms are working simultaneously and will continue to do so for the immediate future. We are not only allowing aid in, but we are ensuring it reaches the people who need it most. Just this Monday, for example, 170 trucks carrying humanitarian aid entered Gaza through Kerem Shalom crossing. These trucks delivered food, medical supplies, and vaccines. Every single delivery was carefully coordinated to prevent looting by Hamas. Since May 19, almost 9,000 tons of aid have entered Gaza, again carrying food, medical supplies, flour for bakeries, and baby formula. In recent weeks, 4 new aid distribution centers have been established inside Gaza. These centers are operated by international humanitarian organizations and secured by a US civilian security company. They were created to serve one purpose: to ensure aid gets to civilians, not terrorists. 2 of these centers, located in Tel El Sultan in Rafah and the Morag Corridor, began operations yesterday. They are already distributing food packages to thousands of families in need. This is happening despite Hamas's attempts to block civilians reaching the aid by establishing checkpoints and roadblocks. Because Hamas knows if it loses control over the aid, it loses control over the people of Gaza. You know, let's ask ourselves what happened after. Have we heard any condemnation from the UN? Not one word, no statement. But that silence is not the end of the story. It gets worse. The United Nations has once again picked the wrong side. Today, I reveal shocking information. Not only has the UN refused to condemn Hamas for its efforts to sabotage the new aid centers. We have seen the pictures of Hamas blocking people. But the UN is now actively joining Hamas in trying to block that aid. The UN is using threats, intimidation, and retaliation against NGOs that choose to participate in the new humanitarian mechanism. A number of major international NGOs made a decision to take part in the new aid initiative. They decided to ignore the UN's calls for a boycott. They are allowed to do it. They said, we want to give it a try. We want to help this new mechanism. They chose to act because they truly care about what happened. The UN's response was brutal. It was mafia-like. Without any discussion, without due process, the UN removed those NGOs from the shared aid database. That database, I want to remind you, is a central system for tracking aid deliveries into Gaza. It was created and approved under a UN General Assembly resolution. But those NGOs, they were frozen out. This is the gravest violation of the UN's own principles. It is the extortion of well-meaning NGOs that refuse to kiss the ring. It is a shakedown by UN mobsters. How can they do that? If you don't want to participate, I think it's a mistake. I think there is room for humanitarian aid from all directions at this stage, but to actually threaten NGOs not to collaborate with this new mechanism, I urge the UN, do not let your egos get in the way. Cooperate with the new mechanism. It has begun and it is operational. Shift your focus from dramatic press statements and intimidating NGOs to the work you are supposed to be doing. Mr. President, negotiations for the release of our hostages are ongoing as we speak. We accepted the last offer on the table, but Hamas said no. It is Hamas that has refused every credible offer. It is Hamas that continues to use human beings, our hostages, who they have cruelly held for 600 days now, as currency. International pressure remains fixed on Israel, not the terrorists. That pressure only plays into Hamas's hands. It strengthens the terrorists. It prolongs the war. With this pressure, you are not advancing peace, you are advancing Hamas. Still, the simple fact remains that there can be no progress until all our hostages are released. Everyone. No statement, no resolution, no futile conference at the UN will change this. We are committed to bringing them home, through negotiations if possible, through military pressure if necessary. But we will not leave them behind. We will not apologize for defending our people from those who will destroy us. No matter how many lies are told, no matter how many blood libels are spread, we will continue to fight for the lives of our citizens and for the future of our people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Israel for his statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the United Arab Emirates.
سيد الرئيس يسرني أن ألقي هذا البيان باسم المجموعة العربية وأتوجه بالشكر إلى السيدة سيغريد كاغ على إحاطتها الشاملة ولمسؤولي الأمم المتحدة بمن فيهم السيد توم فليتشر على دورهم الحيوي في ظل الكارثة الإنسانية في قطاع غزة. كما أعرب عن خالص التقدير للدكتور فيروز سدوة على كلمته المؤثرة وتفاؤله في تقديم العمل العون الإنساني لأهالي غزة. السيد الرئيس، لقد شهدنا منذ خرق وقف إطلاق النار من قبل إسرائيل في مارس الماضي تدميرا منهجيا لحياة وآمال أكثر من 2 مليون فلسطيني في غزة، بعد أن عاشوا في بداية هذا العام شهرين من الهدوء النسبي الذي لم يدوم طويلا. فسرعان ما استأنفت قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي هجماتها على القطاع، وتحولت الآمال التي عاشها المدنيون إلى كوابيس حقيقية. وتتجسد هذه المأساة في قصة الدكتورة إيلاء النجار، طبيبة الأطفال في مستشفى ناصر التي فقدت 9 من أطفالها العشرة في قصف إسرائيلي استهدف منزلها بينما كانت في المستشفى تعالج ضحايا العدوان، في حادثة تمثل وللأسف وجها واحدا فقط من الأوجه العديدة للمأساة في غزة. وتجدد المجموعة العربية إدانتها للحصار الشامل الذي فرضته إسرائيل على قطاع غزة ومنعها لدخول المساعدات الإنسانية لحوالي 3 أشهر، الأمر الذي أدى إلى تفاقم الأوضاع الإنسانية وصولا إلى حد المجاعة التي بدأت تتجسد ملامحها بالفعل. ومع تراكم أكثر من 160 ألف طن من الإمدادات الغذائية على المنافذ، يتكشف أمامنا بوضوح الاستخدام المقصود للتجويع كسلاح حرب في انتهاك صارخ للقانون الدولي الإنساني. وعلى الرغم من سماح إسرائيل مؤخرا بدخول 400 شاحنة مساعدات إلى غزة عبر معبر كرم أبو سالم، فقد تم تسليم المساعدات من 115 شاحنة فقط، بما يمثل قطرة في محيط الاحتياجات الإنسانية الهائلة في غزة، بينما لم تصل أي من هذه المساعدات إلى شمال القطاع. ولا شك بأن مشهد الفوضى التي عمت أحد مراكز توزيع المساعدات في غزة بالأمس يثبت مجددا ضرورة إيصال المساعدات إلى كافة أرجاء القطاع بشكل فوري وكامل وكاف ودون عوائق، وبالتنسيق مع الأمم المتحدة وفقا لخطتها المكونة من 5 مراحل لتوزيع المساعدات على جميع مستحقيها في غزة. وتطالب المجموعة العربية إسرائيل بالسماح بتنفيذ هذه الخطة دون تأخير وفاء بالتزاماتها كقوة قائمة بالاحتلال، فيما تجدد المجموعة رفضها للنظام المقترح من إسرائيل بشأن المساعدات والذي يخالف مبادئ العمل الإنساني والتزامات إسرائيل بموجب القانون الدولي الإنساني. وفي هذا السياق ترحب المجموعة بصدور عدد من البيانات حول فلسطين خلال شهر مايو الجاري، وفي مقدمتها البيان الصادر في 16 من مايو عن 7 دول أوروبية، وهي أيسلندا وإيرلندا ولوكسمبورغ ومالطا والنرويج وسلوفينيا وإسبانيا. والبيان المشترك الصادر في 19 من مايو عن المملكة المتحدة وفرنسا وكندا، فضلا عن البيان الصادر في اليوم نفسه عن عدد من الدول المانحة في هذا الشأن. كما تعيد المجموعة التأكيد على ما ورد في بيانات اللجنة الوزارية المكلفة من القمة العربية الإسلامية بشأن غزة، وآخرها البيان الصادر في 25 من مايو الجاري. وبالتوازي مع ذلك يشكل التصعيد العسكري الإسرائيلي منذ منتصف مايو تطورا خطيرا يهدف لفرض سيطرة إلى جانب المحاولات لعسكرة المساعدات الإنسانية وفرض السيطرة عليها تحقيقا للهدف المعلن بجعل الحياة مستحيلة في غزة ودفع سكانها للهجرة القسرية والاستيلاء على الأرض الفلسطينية في انتهاك صارخ للقانون الدولي. ومن جانب آخر تدين المجموعة العربية التصعيد العسكري الإسرائيلي في الضفة الغربية واستمرار إسرائيل في هدم المنازل وضم الأراضي وتوسيع المستوطنات وترسيخ الاحتلال. وتشدد المجموعة على وجوب احترام الوضع القانوني والتاريخي القائم للمقدسات الإسلامية والمسيحية في مدينة القدس. كما تؤكد المجموعة رفضها القاطع لمحاولات التهجير القسري للشعب الفلسطيني من كامل أراضيه، وتؤكد على محورية الخطة العربية الإسلامية للتعافي المبكر وإعادة إعمار وتنمية غزة المقدمة من مصر بالتنسيق مع دولة فلسطين والأمم المتحدة، والتي لاقت ترحيبا دوليا واسع النطاق. وتحث المجموعة على توفير الدعم السياسي والمالي اللازم لتنفيذ الخطة والمشاركة بفعالية في المؤتمر المنتظر لاستضافته في القاهرة لبحث سبل إعادة إعمار القطاع. إلى جانب ذلك تطالب المجموعة العربية إسرائيل برفع القيود المفروضة على عمل وكالة الأونروا والتي يمثل دورها العمود الفقري للاستجابة الإنسانية في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة، ويجسد التزام المجتمع الدولي تجاه حقوق لاجئي فلسطين بما في ذلك حقهم في العودة والتعويض تماشيا مع القرارات الأممية ذات الصلة. وتشدد المجموعة العربية مجددا على ضرورة إنهاء العدوان الإسرائيلي على غزة، وتطالب بالتزام إسرائيل بالاتفاقية الدولية المتعلقة بمنع الإبادة الجماعية ورفع الحصار واستئناف تنفيذ وقف إطلاق النار وفقا لقرار مجلس الأمن 2735 ووقف كافة الانتهاكات ضد المدنيين والبنية التحتية المدنية والعاملين الإنسانيين بمن فيهم العاملين في المجال الطبي وضمان حماية المدنيين والإفراج عن الأسرى والمحتجزين. وتقدر المجموعة جهود الوساطة المستمرة لكل من جمهورية مصر العربية ودولة قطر والولايات المتحدة بغية ضمان تحقيق وقف دائم لإطلاق النار واستئناف دخول المساعدات الإنسانية وتبادل الأسرى والمحتجزين والانسحاب الكامل لقوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي من غزة. السيد الرئيس، إن استمرار دوامة المعاناة والتشريد والقتل في غزة لأكثر من 19 شهرا يشكل وصمة عار في تاريخ الإنسانية، ويتوجب على هذا المجلس أن يرتقي إلى مستوى مسؤولياته التاريخية ويتخذ قراراً لوقف هذه الحرب بشكل دائم وشامل، فكل تأخير في تحقيق ذلك سيعني تفاقم معاناة المدنيين وإزهاق المزيد من الأرواح. وعليه تدعو المجموعة العربية مجلس الأمن إلى الانخراط الإيجابي مع مشروع القرار المطروح من قبل الجزائر والمدعوم من عدد من أعضاء المجلس، والذي يدعو لوقف إطلاق النار فورا ومن دون شروط ورفع جميع العراقيل عن المساعدات الإنسانية وتوزيعها وفقا للمبادئ الإنسانية. وبينما نتطلع إلى المؤتمر الدولي رفيع المستوى حول حل الدولتين المقرر في يونيو برئاسة مشتركة للمملكة العربية السعودية والجمهورية الفرنسية، فإننا نؤكد أن نجاح أي جهد دبلوماسي يتطلب إرادة سياسية صادقة والتزامات واضحة من جميع الأطراف لتحقيق السلام. وعليه تطالب المجموعة العربية الدول التي لم تعترف بدولة فلسطين بعد بالقيام بذلك وتوفير الدعم السياسي والمالي للشعب الفلسطيني ولدولة فلسطين ولسيادتها على كامل الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة بما في ذلك القدس الشريف، ووضع حد للانتهاكات القانون الدولي وكافة محاولات الضم والتهجير، ودعم الخطة العربية الإسلامية لإعادة الإعمار إلى جانب توفير الحماية الدولية للشعب الفلسطيني. ختاما، تجدد المجموعة العربية التزامها الثابت بالعمل مع جميع الشركاء نحو التوصل لحل شامل للصراع مبني على حل الدولتين وقراراتها الشرعية الدولية
and
بما
relevant
يضمن
international
إنهاء
resolutions.
الاحتلال
A settlement that
وتجسيد الدولة
ensures ending the
الفلسطينية
occupation,
المستقلة
establishing an
وعاصمتها
independent
القدس
Palestinian
الشريف
state with Jerusalem
ويحقق
as
السلام
its
العادل
capital to
والدائم
pave the way
والأمن
toward
والاستقرار في
achieving a
المنطقة.
just and lasting
شكرا
peace,
سيد
as well as
الرئيس.
security and stability across the region. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. There are no more names inscribed in the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
gentleman, Sigrid Kaag.
Yes. Hello, good morning. Well, it's been an open session. You've heard the Council, you've heard myself, you've heard the briefer, and I think we're at a very difficult moment. You've heard me say the two-state solutions on life support, and with a very strong push for member states to have courage, conviction, and for peace to really win over politics. We have no other message. Situation in Gaza, of course, we discussed extensively. I mean, you've heard me speak. I don't want to waste words amidst such suffering. Edie.
Yes, Edie.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kaag. A couple of questions. First, could you answer what the Israeli ambassador said about 400 trucks being on the Kerem Shalom side and not actually moving or getting to warehouses and to people in need? I know you said that it's like a lifeboat after the ship has sunk. And secondly, does the UN have any information on the number of people injured and killed at the aid distribution yesterday by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation?
I think I need to answer your two questions, sadly fairly generically, because it's very dangerous to say what about this instance. I'm in New York now, my colleagues are working on the ground, they may have the latest, and the humanitarian team is issuing a statement. When it comes more generally to the UN's ability to collect and then distribute what is on or in the trucks, that has been subjected to a number of new measures or restrictions and has only hampered our very limited ability to operate in what is an active war zone, including also, of course, the humanitarian zone. The rules have changed, the drivers were vetted, then there were other measures introduced. So it's not as simple and not as black and white, they're there and the UN isn't coming. It is intrinsically more complicated. So I don't want to go into 400 trucks or 9,000 or the volume of 9,000. I think the biggest message is aid needs to be allowed in, sustained, in the volume that is needed to reach all people and allow the UN and the humanitarian partners to do their job the way they've always done and the way they do it wherever else in the world in times of conflict in accordance with international humanitarian law. We shouldn't get stuck on side roads. The high road is, does the aid reach people? Is it sustained and is it the right volume in accordance with their very broad needs, because people in Gaza need everything. It's no coincidence that I said people do not say anymore, I'll see you tomorrow, I'll see you in heaven. There's a lot of sadness and weight behind that expression. It says it all.
Michelle Nicholas from Reuters. The Israeli ambassador said the two mechanisms would continue operating for the moment. Has Israel indicated at all to the UN as to whether the UN might get cut off and the only option is to go through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation? Steve Witkoff has just said in the Oval Office that they've got a new term sheet. They're hoping the president will sign off on it for a ceasefire push. Are you aware of what might be in this? Have you spoken with Mr. Witkoff? Do you share his optimism that this could be a resolution?
I think I learned one ground rule in Dutch politics. I don't comment on the comments by others, and I haven't been in the room. So I'm not going to do that. We'll need to wait to be informed. Our focus at the moment, of course, is on the assistance getting in. We're not negotiating. We obviously keep pushing for an immediate ceasefire and the unconditional release of the hostages, as well as the return of the remains. But the negotiators are dealing with this. When it comes to how long will the UN or partners be allowed to function? First of all, we were told as of 24th of May, the foundation would take over. Well, we've seen that. Now there's a space, it seems, where we are working in parallel. There's no cutoff date. The point is, we need to reach all people in Gaza. They shouldn't be displaced again and again just to receive aid, and it needs to be done on a daily basis in a manner that is incumbent and aligned with international humanitarian law. I'm not going to speculate about the rest. The UN's plan is very clear, and we continue to ask support for our way of working. Sorry.
Kristen Salumi from Algeria, English. I noticed you were speaking with the U.S. Representative on the sidelines here. The UN has really been sidelined not only in the aid process but in the peace process. Can you give us any indication of your relationship with the United States officials and what your appeal to them has been?
Well, I think our appeal is not different from Party A to Party B. I think the line when it comes to realization of rights, safety and security of Israel, the need for a two-state solution, not now, not next week, it should have been achieved a long time ago. Those are, I think, principled positions by the UN. We're willing to facilitate, willing to help, we're on the ground. That doesn't differ. Earlier I've had a number of contacts with the new officials of the new US administration, but we know there is a different way of working, and we're very frequently in touch with negotiators, particularly Egypt and Qatar, but ultimately international consensus and legitimacy rests with the resolutions and the Council. And I think it's very fair that a number of Council members and myself referred with great emphasis to the two-state conference, co-chaired rather, by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, because it's a critical moment in time. It was no coincidence that I said the two-state solutions on life support, and all measures that are taken and continue to be taken, settlements, violence, housing demolitions, all risk creating a very irreversible situation that the two-state solution is no longer truly something that you can realize. Slimane Mansour's famous artwork of 1996 actually points to that. Thank you. I think it's the last question. I have to catch a plane, as always.
Jessica Lematurier from France 24. How concerned are you that US mercenaries are now operating inside Gaza, some of them linked to that notorious firm Blackwater?
Yeah.
How concerning is that for you? Are you going to speak out against it?
Well, I think the UN has spoken very clearly as to what we consider alignment and compliance with international law. That speaks to our plan. I think the privatization of aid and the weaponization of aid is a very dangerous precedent. It doesn't only speak to the situation potentially in Gaza, but worldwide. And we have to look at the things we allow, don't allow, or speak out against, or discourage. It's not only relevant to the here and the now, it is relevant to so many other conflict situations. So I would say support the UN. I'm not going to speculate about everything else I haven't seen, but it's pretty clear. Let's say the experiences of the past speak for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.